Hello, friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The fluorescent lights in the Gainesville Police Department Dispatch Center hummed their familiar tune as Janet Cole settled into her midnight shift. 23 years of taking emergency calls had taught her to recognize the different types of fear in a caller's voice. The sharp panic of a car accident, the controlled terror of a home invasion, the confused distress of a medical emergency. But when the phone rang at 12:47 a.m. that frigid January night, she encountered something that would challenge everything she thought she knew about her job and haunt her for years to come. The voice that came through her headset belonged to an elderly woman, clearly terrified and speaking in hushed, urgent tones that suggested she was trying not to be overheard. Eleanor Whitman identified herself as living alone on Archer Road, about 12 miles southwest of downtown Gainesville, in one of the most isolated parts of Alachua County. The area was a patchwork of horse farms, cattle ranches, and old Florida homesteads where houses sat on 20-acre lots, and the nearest neighbor might be half a mile away through pine forests and palmetto scrub. Mrs. Whitman reported a man walking around her property for the past hour and 15 minutes, circling her house with what appeared to be deliberate, methodical intent. Janet could hear the genuine fear in the elderly woman's voice as she described how the figure would disappear for several minutes, only to reappear at a different window, always staying just at the edge of her porch light's reach. The caller's breathing was shallow and rapid, and Janet could detect the slight tremor in her voice that indicated someone trying very hard to maintain control while genuinely terrified. "He knows I'm watching him," Mrs. Whitman whispered into the phone, her voice barely audible over the connection. "Sometimes he stops and looks right at the window where I'm standing, like he can see me through the curtains. But he stays in the shadows where I can't get a good look at his face. He's been doing this for over an hour now, just walking around and around my house, and I know he's planning something terrible." Officer Sarah Martinez was 28 minutes out when she received the dispatch call. Her patrol car cutting through the humid Florida night on Highway 121 toward the rural area where Archer Road intersected with a maze of dirt roads and horse trails. At 34, Martinez had been with the Gainesville Police Department for 9 years, mostly working the overnight shift in the areas where the city boundaries blurred into unincorporated county land. She knew Archer Road well, a desolate stretch of cracked asphalt that wound through cattle pastures, horse farms, and orange groves, where houses sat far back from the road behind electronic gates, and long driveways lined with Spanish moss-draped oak trees. Martinez understood the unique vulnerabilities of rural policing in north-central Florida. Response times were measured in half hours rather than minutes. Backup could be 45 minutes away, and the isolation that attracted people seeking privacy also attracted those who preyed on the vulnerable. She had worked dozens of prowler calls in similar locations, most of which turned out to be wildlife. Teenagers looking for places to party, or transients seeking shelter in abandoned buildings. But something about Mrs. Whitman's call felt different. The specificity of her observations, the controlled fear in her voice, and the methodical nature of the prowler's behavior all suggested something more serious than the usual mischief. As Martinez drove through the darkness, her patrol car's headlights illuminating the narrow country roads lined with palmetto scrub and drainage ditches, she maintained radio contact with Mrs. Whitman through dispatch. The elderly woman's voice grew increasingly agitated as she reported that the prowler had moved to her back door and appeared to be testing the lock, rattling the handle quietly but persistently. Then he had moved to her kitchen window, where she could see his silhouette against the glass as he appeared to be looking inside, studying the layout of her home. "He's not acting like someone who's lost or confused," Mrs. Whitman told dispatch, her voice tight with fear. "He's acting like someone who's been here before, like he knows exactly where everything is. He's avoiding the motion sensor light by my garage, and he stepped over the loose board on my front steps that always creaks. How would he know about that, unless he'd been watching my house for a long time?" The observation sent a chill through Martinez as she pushed her Crown Victoria harder, the engine straining as she navigated the narrow country roads. A prowler who knew the specific details of a property's security measures and structural quirks was conducting surveillance, not random mischief. This suggested a level of planning and preparation that indicated serious criminal intent, possibly a home invasion or worse. The Whitman property sat at the end of a quarter-mile dirt driveway that wound through a grove of ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss. The driveway was deeply rutted from years of Florida's alternating droughts and torrential rains, and Martinez had to slow to a crawl to avoid damaging her patrol car's suspension. As she approached the house, her headlights illuminated a modest ranch-style home with a wraparound porch, probably built in the 1960s when this part of Florida was still considered frontier territory. The house was dark, except for a single porch light and the blue glow of a television visible through the front window. Martinez parked near the front steps and immediately began scanning the property with her maglite, looking for any sign of the reported intruder. The beam of her flashlight swept across an overgrown garden, a small barn that hadn't housed animals in years, and a well house that appeared to date back to the original construction of the property. She announced her arrival over the radio and approached the front door, her hand instinctively resting on her service weapon. The wooden porch creaked under her boots as she knocked and identified herself as Gainesville Police. After several moments, she heard the sound of multiple locks being disengaged, deadbolts, chain locks, and what sounded like a security bar being removed from the door. The elderly woman who answered was exactly what Martinez had expected from their radio conversations through dispatch. Eleanor Whitman appeared to be in her late 70s, wearing a faded housecoat over flannel pajamas and clutching a cordless phone in one hand and a baseball bat in the other. She was sharp and articulate despite her obvious distress, and Martinez could see the intelligence in her eyes, even as they darted nervously toward the windows and doors. Mrs. Whitman was a retired English teacher who had lived on the property for over 30 years, since her late husband had bought the land with dreams of raising quarter horses and living the rural Florida lifestyle. As she led Martinez through the house, pointing out the windows where she had seen the prowler, Mrs. Whitman's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady and detailed. She had taught high school English for 42 years before retiring, and her training in observation and description served her well as she recounted the evening's events with precision that impressed Martinez. This wasn't an elderly woman imagining threats or misinterpreting normal sounds. This was someone who had observed genuine suspicious activity and was reporting it accurately. The house itself told the story of a woman living alone on a teacher's pension, but maintaining her independence and dignity. The furniture was well maintained but dated. Family photographs covered every available surface, and the smell of arthritis cream and old books permeated the air. Mrs. Whitman explained that she rarely had visitors anymore since her husband's death 5 years earlier, that her nearest neighbor was Frank Caruso, who lived about 3/4 of a mile down Archer Road, and that she had lived peacefully and safely on the property until tonight. "I've never been afraid here before," Mrs. Whitman told Martinez as they stood in her living room, the elderly woman's voice carrying a note of sadness along with fear. "Harold and I raised our children here, and after he passed, I thought about moving to one of those senior communities in town, but this is my home and I couldn't bear to leave all the memories. Now, I'm wondering if I made a mistake staying here alone." Martinez conducted a thorough search of the grounds, her flashlight beam sweeping across the 5-acre property that was mostly open pasture returning to native vegetation. The old horse barn stood empty except for some rusted farm equipment and hay that had been there for years. The well house was locked and showed no signs of recent disturbance. A small storage shed contained lawn equipment and Christmas decorations, but nothing suggested it had been tampered with. However, the soft sandy soil around the house told a different story. Martinez found several sets of footprints that appeared fresh, including some that were clearly Mrs. Whitman's house slippers from when she had checked her mailbox earlier that day, but others belonged to work boots, size 10 or 11, with a distinctive tread pattern that showed deliberate movement around the perimeter of the house. The boot prints formed an almost perfect circle around the property, stopping at each window and door as if someone had been conducting a systematic reconnaissance of the house's vulnerabilities. What disturbed Martinez most was how the prints seemed to indicate that whoever had made them had spent considerable time studying the house, learning Mrs. Whitman's routines, and identifying potential entry points. The prints showed that the person had tested several windows, had examined the back door lock closely enough to leave scuff marks on the metal, and had even climbed onto the front porch to look through the living room window. Martinez photographed the prints with her digital camera and noted their locations in her report, creating a detailed map of the prowler's movements around the property. She also collected plaster casts of the clearest boot prints, following procedures she had learned for preserving evidence in stalking and home invasion cases. The methodical nature of the surveillance suggested this wasn't random criminal behavior, but rather the work of someone who was planning a specific crime against Mrs. Whitman. After completing her initial investigation of the grounds, Martinez sat with Mrs. Whitman in her living room, drinking coffee from china cups that probably dated back to the 1970s, and taking a detailed statement about the evening's events. The elderly woman recounted how she had first noticed movement outside around 11:15 p.m., while watching the late local news on WCJB. Initially, she had dismissed it as deer or wild hogs, both common in the rural area around Archer Road. But when she saw a clearly human figure pass by her kitchen window, moving with purpose rather than the random wandering of wildlife, she knew someone was on her property with no legitimate reason to be there. Mrs. Whitman had turned off all the lights in her house and had watched through her curtains as the figure methodically circled her home, sometimes stopping to peer through windows when he thought the rooms were empty. He moved like someone who knew exactly what he was doing, Mrs. Whitman told Martinez, her voice steady despite the fear that was evident in her eyes. He wasn't stumbling around or acting confused like someone who might be lost or intoxicated. He was studying my house, learning about it, and that terrified me more than if he had just tried to break in right away. It felt like he was planning something, taking his time to make sure he could do whatever he wanted without being stopped. Martinez found Mrs. Whitman's account both credible and deeply concerning. Home invasions targeting elderly rural residents had been increasing across north-central Florida over the past 2 years, often perpetrated by individuals who spent days or weeks conducting surveillance on their victims before striking. The isolated location, the elderly occupant living alone, and the methodical nature of the prowler's behavior all fit the pattern that Gainesville police had identified in a series of similar crimes across Alachua County. She advised Mrs. Whitman to keep all doors and windows locked, to call 911 immediately if she saw anyone on her property again, and to consider installing additional security measures such as motion-activated lights and security cameras. Martinez also promised to increase patrols in the area and to check on Mrs. Whitman personally over the next few days. Before leaving, she walked the perimeter of the property one more time with her flashlight. noting that the boot prints led to a spot near the tree line where someone had apparently parked a vehicle, evidenced by tire tracks in the soft ground and crushed vegetation. The tire tracks were from a pickup truck or SUV, based on the width and tread pattern, and they showed that the vehicle had been positioned where it couldn't be seen from the house or the road, but provided a clear view of Mrs. Whitman's property. Martinez photographed the tire tracks and measured them, adding this evidence to her growing case file. The location of the vehicle suggested that whoever had been watching Mrs. Whitman was experienced at surveillance and understood how to observe without being detected. Martinez returned to the police station as the sun was beginning to rise over Gainesville, the morning mist rising from the Paynes Prairie as she drove back into the city. She spent the remainder of her shift writing a detailed report about the incident, including her observations about the methodical nature of the surveillance and her concerns that Mrs. Whitman might be targeted for a future crime. She flagged the case as high priority and requested that it be assigned to the department's detective division for follow-up investigation. The next morning, Martinez returned to the Whitman property during daylight hours to conduct a more thorough investigation. In the bright Florida sunshine, she could see details that had been invisible the night before. The boot prints were even more extensive than she had realized, indicating that the prowler had spent at least 2 hours circling the house, probably over multiple visits. More concerning, she found evidence that he had climbed onto the back porch and had been able to look directly into Mrs. Whitman's bedroom window. Martinez also discovered something that sent a chill down her spine and confirmed her worst fears about the case. Hidden among the palmetto bushes about 50 yards from the house, concealed but positioned with a clear view of Mrs. Whitman's front door, she found a small camping chair and the remnants of several cigarettes. The cigarette butts were a mix of brands, Marlboro Reds, Camel Lights, and generic brands, suggesting either multiple people had been involved in the surveillance, or someone who wasn't particular about what they smoked. The camping chair was lightweight and portable, the type used by hunters or outdoor enthusiasts, and it showed signs of repeated use over several days. The grass around the chair was flattened, and Martinez found additional evidence that someone had been eating meals there: candy bar wrappers, empty soda bottles, and the remains of fast food containers. This wasn't a one-time reconnaissance mission. Someone had been watching Mrs. Whitman's house for extended periods over at least a week, learning her routines and waiting for the right opportunity to strike. Martinez carefully collected all of the evidence, photographing everything in place before bagging and tagging items for forensic analysis. She called for a crime scene technician to process the area and dust the chair and bottles for fingerprints. The discovery of the surveillance post transformed the case from a simple prowler call into a potential stalking and home invasion investigation that required immediate attention from the department's detective division. Detective Raymond Torres took over the case that afternoon and immediately recognized the professional nature of the surveillance activities. Torres was a 20-year veteran of the Gainesville Police Department who had specialized in crimes against the elderly for the past 5 years after his own grandmother had been victimized by a home invasion crew that targeted seniors. He understood the psychology of predators who chose elderly victims and the sophisticated methods some of them employed to avoid detection. The prowler wasn't acting randomly or impulsively, Torres realized as he reviewed Martinez's report and evidence. He was conducting what amounted to military-style reconnaissance, gathering intelligence about his target's habits, security measures, and the likelihood of interruption. Torres had seen similar patterns in cases involving experienced criminals, often those with military or law enforcement backgrounds who understood how to observe without being detected, and how to plan crimes that minimized risk while maximizing success. Torres decided to expand his investigation beyond just the Whitman property, recognizing that predators who conducted this level of surveillance typically had multiple targets and operated across wider geographic areas. He contacted other law enforcement agencies in north central Florida to determine if similar incidents had been reported in their jurisdictions. What he discovered added a new level of urgency to the case and confirmed his suspicions about the professional nature of the threat. The investigation took on new urgency when Torres discovered that similar home invasion patterns had been reported in 4 other counties across north central and central Florida over the past 8 months. In each case, elderly residents living alone had reported prowlers and surveillance activities in the weeks before their homes were burglarized. 3 of the victims had been physically assaulted during the crimes, and 2 elderly women had been hospitalized with injuries sustained during robberies, making this potentially a pattern that could escalate to homicide. Torres coordinated with detectives from Marion, Levy, Bradford, and Clay counties to share information and identify common elements in the cases. The geographic pattern suggested someone who was familiar with rural north central Florida and who had the mobility and resources to operate across multiple jurisdictions without detection. The timing of the crimes indicated careful planning and patience, with the perpetrator conducting surveillance for weeks before striking during periods when victims were most vulnerable and when police response times would be longest. The breakthrough in the case came when Torres received a call from Detective Lisa Morrison of the Marion County Sheriff's Office. Morrison had been working a series of similar home invasions around Ocala and had developed a person of interest who matched the profile Torres was building. The suspect was Marcus Vance, a 36-year-old former Army Ranger with a dishonorable discharge and an extensive criminal history, including burglary, assault, and stalking. Vance had been dishonorably discharged from the military after being caught selling weapons and equipment to civilians, and his psychological evaluation had noted antisocial tendencies and a lack of empathy for others. After his discharge, he had drifted through several states, supporting himself through various crimes that demonstrated increasingly sophisticated planning and execution. His military training had given him skills in surveillance, reconnaissance, and tactical planning that made him far more dangerous than the typical burglar or home invader. Detective Morrison shared Vance's file with Torres, including photographs, fingerprints, and details about his known associates and criminal methods. Vance typically targeted elderly residents in rural areas, conducting weeks of surveillance before striking. He favored homes that were isolated and occupied by single elderly women, whom he perceived as the most vulnerable targets. His previous crimes had shown an escalating pattern of violence, starting with simple burglary, but progressing to assault and intimidation as he grew more confident in his abilities to avoid detection. The most disturbing aspect of Vance's criminal history was his psychological profile, which indicated that he derived satisfaction not just from the financial gain of his crimes, but from the fear and suffering he inflicted on his victims. Several survivors of his previous attacks had reported that he seemed to enjoy terrorizing them, often spending unnecessary time in their homes after completing his theft, apparently savoring their helplessness and fear. With a specific suspect identified, Torres was able to coordinate a multi-agency task force to locate and apprehend Vance before he could strike at Mrs. Whitman's property or target additional elderly victims. The task force included detectives from 5 counties, tactical officers prepared for a high-risk arrest, and federal agents from the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force who had been tracking similar patterns of crimes against the elderly across the Southeast. The investigation revealed that Vance had been operating in north central Florida for at least 6 months, renting a small apartment in Chiefland under a false name, and using stolen vehicles for his surveillance and crimes. He had targeted at least 12 elderly residents across the region, conducting surveillance on all of them, but only striking at 7 properties where he determined the risks were minimal and the potential rewards were greatest. Meanwhile, Officer Martinez continued her patrols of the Archer Road area, maintaining regular contact with Mrs. Whitman and other vulnerable residents in the rural community. She had developed a personal connection to the case, recognizing that Mrs. Whitman reminded her of her own grandmother who had lived alone in rural Texas until her death. The thought of someone preying on elderly people who had worked hard their entire lives and deserved to feel safe in their homes motivated Martinez to go beyond her normal duties, checking on isolated residents and building relationships that would help her identify potential threats. Martinez also began working with the department's crime prevention unit to organize community meetings for elderly residents in rural areas, teaching them how to recognize surveillance activities and providing practical advice for improving their personal security. The meetings were held at churches, community centers, and senior centers throughout Alachua County, and they attracted dozens of elderly residents who had been feeling increasingly vulnerable as news of the home invasions spread through the community. During one of these meetings, Martinez met Frank Caruso, Mrs. Whitman's nearest neighbor, who provided crucial information that helped advance the investigation. Caruso was a 78-year-old retired mechanic who lived alone in a mobile home, surrounded by old cars and farm equipment. He was initially reluctant to talk about what he had observed, worried that he might be making something out of nothing, but eventually admitted that he too had noticed unusual activity in the area over the past 2 weeks. Caruso had seen an unfamiliar pickup truck driving slowly along Archer Road at odd hours, always during the late evening or early morning when most residents would be asleep. The truck appeared to be conducting surveillance, stopping at various points along the road where the driver could observe houses without being easily seen. On 3 occasions, Caruso had observed someone walking through the orange grove that bordered both his and Mrs. Whitman's properties, moving with purpose rather than the aimless wandering of someone who might be lost. Caruso's description of the pickup truck was helpful and matched intelligence that Torres had received from other counties. It was a dark-colored Ford F-150, probably 10 to 15 years old, with damage to the front bumper and a distinctively loud exhaust system that made it audible from a considerable distance. The driver appeared to be a younger man, probably in his 30s or 40s, but Caruso had never gotten close enough to provide a detailed physical description. Most importantly, Caruso had written down the truck's license plate number during one of his observations, thinking it might be useful if anything suspicious happened in the neighborhood. The plate number that Caruso provided matched the vehicle that Detective Morrison had connected to Marcus Vance in Marion County, confirming that the same individual was responsible for the surveillance activities at Mrs. Whitman's property and the previous crimes across the region. Armed with this new information and the positive identification of Vance as the suspect, Torres was able to convince a judge to issue warrants for Vance's arrest on charges of stalking, criminal trespass, and conspiracy to commit burglary. The task force began coordinating surveillance of Vance's known locations and associates, preparing to arrest him before he could complete his planned attack on Mrs. Whitman or move on to other targets. The investigation took an unexpected turn when surveillance officers observed Vance conducting reconnaissance at 2 additional properties in Alachua County, both occupied by elderly women living alone. The additional targets indicated that Vance was planning multiple crimes in rapid succession, probably intending to complete several burglaries before moving on to a different geographic area, as he had done in previous states. Detective Torres realized that simply arresting Vance when he returned to his apartment might not prevent him from striking at his intended targets, as he might have accomplices or might return to the area even after being released on bond. The decision was made to wait until Vance actually attempted to enter Mrs. Whitman's property, allowing the task force to arrest him in the act of committing the crime and ensuring that the charges would be sufficient to keep him in custody pending trial. On January 28, 13 days after Mrs. Whitman's initial 911 call, surveillance teams reported that Vance had driven past her property twice during the late afternoon, apparently conducting final reconnaissance before making his move. Task force officers positioned themselves in concealed locations around the property, coordinating with Martinez, who would be conducting her regular patrol of the area as a backup plan in case something went wrong with the surveillance operation. Martinez was driving her regular patrol route on Archer Road when she noticed fresh tire tracks in the sand near the entrance to Mrs. Whitman's driveway. The tracks appeared to have been made within the past few hours and matched the tread pattern she had photographed at the original crime scene. Her heart rate increased as she realized that Vance had returned to complete the crime he had been planning for weeks. Martinez immediately called for backup and proceeded cautiously toward the Whitman house, her adrenaline rising as she realized that the confrontation she had been anticipating was finally about to occur. She coordinated with the task force surveillance teams, who confirmed that Vance's pickup truck was parked in the orange grove about a quarter-mile from the house, concealed but positioned for a quick escape if necessary. As Martinez approached the property, she could see Mrs. Whitman's house in the distance, the porch light creating a small island of illumination in the darkness of the rural Florida night. Through her night vision scope, she could also see a figure moving near the house, and task force spotters confirmed that someone was attempting to force entry through Mrs. Whitman's back door using tools that appeared to be professional locksmith equipment. Martinez parked her patrol car out of sight and coordinated with the task force leaders about the best approach for apprehending Vance without putting Mrs. Whitman at risk. They could see through thermal imaging that the elderly woman was awake and moving around inside her house, probably having heard the sounds of someone attempting to break in. The situation was extremely dangerous because Vance was known to become violent when cornered, and Mrs. Whitman was vulnerable if he managed to gain entry to her home. The task force commander decided to move immediately before Vance could complete his break-in attempt. Officers approached the house from multiple directions, using the natural cover provided by the oak trees and outbuildings to get close without being detected. Martinez was assigned to approach from the front of the house while tactical officers moved to surround the back door where Vance was working. As Martinez got closer to the house, she could see Vance more clearly through her night vision equipment. He was a large man, probably 6 feet tall, and weighing at least 200 pounds, wearing dark clothing and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He was working at Mrs. Whitman's back door with what appeared to be professional lock-picking tools and a small pry bar, demonstrating skills that clearly came from military training and criminal experience. The operation proceeded according to plan until Vance apparently detected the presence of the officers surrounding him. Whether he heard something or simply developed an intuitive sense that he was being watched, he suddenly stopped his attempts to open the door and began looking around with the alert posture of someone who sensed danger. Martinez could see him through her scope as he crouched low and began moving toward the tree line where his truck was parked. The task force commander gave the order to move in before Vance could escape, and officers emerged from their concealed positions with weapons drawn and flashlights illuminated, shouting commands for him to drop his tools and get on the ground. Vance's reaction was immediate and violent. He threw his pry bar at the nearest officer and began running toward the orange grove where his truck was parked, demonstrating the speed and agility that came from his military training. The pursuit that followed tested every aspect of the officer's training and coordination. Vance was younger and in better physical condition than most of the task force members, and he knew the terrain from his weeks of surveillance activities. He ran through the grove with surprising speed, jumping over irrigation ditches and dodging between trees in a clear attempt to reach his vehicle and escape before the officers could surround him. Martinez joined the pursuit, following Vance through the orange grove while maintaining radio contact with other team members and calling out his location as he moved through the darkness. The thermal imaging equipment allowed the task force to track his movements even when he was concealed by vegetation, and they were able to coordinate their approach to cut off his escape routes. Vance reached his truck and was attempting to start the engine when tactical officers caught up to him. He had apparently hidden the keys somewhere in the vehicle and was fumbling to locate them. his hands shaking from adrenaline and exertion. Rather than surrender, Vance attempted to use his truck as a weapon, gunning the engine and trying to ram the officers who were approaching his position. Martinez took cover behind a large orange tree as Vance's truck careened through the grove, its headlights sweeping wildly as he tried to escape while simultaneously attempting to run down the officers pursuing him. The truck eventually crashed into a drainage ditch, the impact disabling the vehicle and apparently stunning Vance temporarily. Officers approached the crashed truck with weapons drawn, ordering Vance to exit with his hands visible. He complied slowly, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he had struck the steering wheel during the crash. Martinez assisted in handcuffing him while other officers secured the scene and called for an ambulance to treat his injuries. Detective Torres arrived at the scene just as EMTs were treating Vance's injuries and preparing to transport him to the hospital. A search of his truck revealed what Torres described as a mobile crime laboratory designed specifically for home invasions. The vehicle contained professional lock-picking tools, glass cutters, zip ties, duct tape, pepper spray, a stun gun, and various other items that demonstrated Vance's criminal sophistication and his intent to use violence if necessary during his crimes. Most disturbing was a detailed notebook that Vance had been keeping, containing surveillance information on Mrs. Whitman and 7 other elderly residents across north-central Florida. The notebook included their daily routines, security measures, assessments of their physical ability to resist an attack, and detailed floor plans of their homes that indicated Vance had been inside the properties at some point to conduct reconnaissance. The notebook also contained something that chilled every investigator who read it: psychological profiles of each victim that included assessments of their likely reactions to being threatened and their potential value as sources of information about other elderly residents in their communities. Vance had been treating his crime spree like a military campaign, gathering intelligence and planning his operations with the same methodical approach he had learned during his military service. Mrs. Whitman was treated for shock and anxiety, but was otherwise unharmed. When Martinez interviewed her the next day, the elderly woman revealed additional information that added another disturbing dimension to the case. She had been receiving hang-up phone calls for the past 3 weeks, always in the evening when she would normally be watching television. She had dismissed them as wrong numbers or telemarketing calls, but now realized they were probably Vance testing to confirm when she was home and awake. Mrs. Whitman also revealed that she had noticed her mail being disturbed and rearranged in her mailbox, and that several utility bills and personal documents had gone missing over the past month. She had attributed these incidents to problems with the Postal Service, but investigators now realized that Vance had been stealing her mail to gather personal information that would help him plan his crime and identify valuable items in her home. The investigation into Vance's activities revealed the full scope of his criminal enterprise and the danger that rural elderly residents faced from predators who specifically targeted them because of their isolation and vulnerability. Over the past 8 months, Vance had conducted surveillance on at least 22 elderly residents across 5 counties, selecting his victims based on their apparent wealth, physical vulnerability, and the remoteness of their properties. Vance had actually burglarized 9 homes during this period, using his military training and criminal skills to enter silently and escape without immediate detection. In several cases, the victims hadn't realized they had been burglarized until days later, as Vance carefully selected items that wouldn't be immediately missed. His psychological profile indicated that he derived satisfaction not only from the financial gain, but also from knowing that he could enter his victims' homes without being detected, violating their sense of safety and security. The investigation also revealed that Vance had been planning to escalate his criminal activities beyond simple burglary. Documents found in his apartment indicated that he had been researching techniques for kidnapping and interrogation, apparently planning to hold victims captive while forcing them to reveal the locations of hidden valuables and provide information about other potential targets in their communities. Vance eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including attempted burglary, stalking, criminal trespass, assault on law enforcement officers, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. During his sentencing hearing, he showed no remorse for his actions, telling the judge that elderly people living alone in rural areas were legitimate military targets, who should have taken better precautions to protect themselves. The judge sentenced him to 35 years in state prison without the possibility of parole, citing his lack of remorse and the sophisticated nature of his criminal enterprise. The case had a profound and lasting impact on the rural law enforcement community throughout north-central Florida. Police departments implemented new protocols for investigating prowler calls involving elderly residents, recognizing that such reports often indicated sophisticated predatory behavior rather than random mischief or teenage pranks. Training programs were developed to help officers recognize the signs of systematic surveillance and to coordinate more effectively with other agencies when patterns suggested multi-jurisdictional criminal activity. Community watch programs were expanded to include regular check-ins with isolated elderly residents, and public education campaigns were launched to help seniors recognize the warning signs of surveillance activities. The Gainesville Police Department worked with local media to publicize safety tips without creating unnecessary fear, emphasizing practical measures that elderly residents could take to improve their security while maintaining their independence. For Officer Martinez, the case represented both a professional triumph and a personal awakening to the unique vulnerabilities faced by elderly residents in rural communities. She transferred to the detective division and specialized in crimes against the elderly, eventually becoming recognized as one of the region's leading experts on predators who target seniors. She developed training programs for other law enforcement agencies and frequently spoke at community meetings about elderly safety and crime prevention. Martinez maintained a relationship with Mrs. Whitman after the case was resolved, checking on her regularly and helping her install additional security measures that allowed her to continue living independently on her beloved property. The elderly woman often expressed gratitude for Martinez's dedication and professionalism, crediting the officer with saving her life and allowing her to maintain her independence in the home she loved. Mrs. Whitman lived for 4 more years after the incident, passing away peacefully in her sleep at age 81. In her will, she left a letter thanking Officer Martinez for her courage and dedication, expressing her hope that other elderly people would never experience the terror of knowing someone was watching them and planning to hurt them. The letter also included a donation to the Gainesville Police Department's crime prevention programs, demonstrating Mrs. Whitman's commitment to helping protect other vulnerable community members. The letter now hangs in Martinez's office, serving as a daily reminder of why the work of law enforcement matters and the difference that one dedicated officer can make in protecting the most vulnerable members of the community. Martinez often refers to the Whitman case when training new officers, emphasizing the importance of taking every call seriously and conducting thorough investigations, even when initial evidence seems limited. The Vance case became a training scenario used by police academies throughout Florida and the Southeast, demonstrating how routine prowler calls can reveal sophisticated criminal enterprises and highlighting the importance of interagency cooperation in addressing crimes that cross jurisdictional boundaries. The case also became a model for understanding how military training and skills can be corrupted and used for criminal purposes, leading to new screening procedures for security companies and private investigation firms that employ former military personnel. Detective Torres continued working crimes against the elderly until his retirement 5 years later, using the experience gained from the Vance case to develop new investigative techniques and prevention strategies. He frequently collaborated with federal agencies to track criminal patterns that crossed state lines, and he became a nationally recognized expert on predators who target elderly victims. The multi-agency task force that apprehended Vance became a permanent unit that continues to operate across north-central Florida, coordinating investigations of crimes against vulnerable populations and sharing intelligence about criminal patterns and suspects. The task force has successfully prevented dozens of similar crimes and has apprehended several other predators who specifically targeted elderly residents in rural communities. Today, Archer Road remains a quiet stretch of rural Florida highway, but the residents who live there remember the winter when a predator stalked their community and the officers who stopped him before he could complete his planned crimes. Mrs. Whitman's house now belongs to her great-niece, who has installed modern security systems but kept the oak trees and wraparound porch that made it a home for over 3 decades. The case file for the Whitman investigation remains one of the most studied in Gainesville Police Department history, not just for its successful resolution, but for what it revealed about the methodical nature of predators who target the elderly and the critical importance of taking every call seriously, no matter how routine it might initially appear. The investigation demonstrated how a single 911 call from a frightened elderly woman could uncover a criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of people across multiple states. In her final report on the case, Officer Martinez wrote that the investigation had taught her that police work isn't just about responding to crimes after they occur, but about protecting people before they become victims. Sometimes, she noted, the most important thing a police officer can do is simply show up when someone calls for help, because you never know when that call might be the difference between life and death. The investigation also highlighted the importance of community partnerships in preventing crimes against vulnerable populations. The information provided by neighbors like Frank Caruso proved crucial to identifying and apprehending Vance, demonstrating that rural communities must work together with law enforcement to protect their most vulnerable members. For the law enforcement community, the Vance case serves as a powerful reminder that criminals who target the elderly often possess sophisticated skills and planning abilities that make them far more dangerous than typical opportunistic criminals. The case emphasized the need for specialized training in recognizing and investigating crimes against seniors, and it led to the development of new protocols for sharing information between agencies when patterns suggest multi-jurisdictional criminal activity. The psychological evaluation of Vance conducted after his arrest provided valuable insights into the mindset of predators who specifically target elderly victims. Dr. Patricia Williams, the forensic psychologist who evaluated Vance, noted that he exhibited a combination of antisocial personality traits and narcissistic tendencies that made him particularly dangerous to vulnerable populations. Vance viewed elderly people not as human beings deserving of respect and protection, but as targets of opportunity who existed solely for his benefit, Dr. Williams wrote in her evaluation. His military training had given him skills that he perverted for criminal purposes, and his lack of empathy allowed him to plan and execute crimes that would terrorize his victims without experiencing any emotional consequences himself. The evaluation also revealed that Vance had been escalating his criminal behavior over time, moving from simple theft to more complex crimes involving surveillance, stalking, and planned violence. Dr. Williams concluded that if he had not been apprehended when he would likely have progressed to kidnapping, torture, and potentially homicide, as he sought new ways to satisfy his need for control and domination over his victims. The case had lasting effects on the rural communities where Vance had operated, with many elderly residents reporting increased anxiety about living alone and concerns about their personal safety. Community organizations and law enforcement agencies worked together to address these concerns through education programs, security assessments, and support services that helped seniors maintain their independence while improving their safety. The Gainesville Police Department established a specialized unit focused on crimes against vulnerable populations, with officers trained specifically in recognizing the signs of elder abuse, financial exploitation, and predatory behavior. The unit works closely with social services agencies, healthcare providers, and community organizations to identify at-risk individuals and provide them with resources and support. Officer Martinez eventually became the supervisor of this specialized unit, using her experience from the Vance case to develop comprehensive training programs for other law enforcement agencies throughout Florida. She frequently speaks at national conferences about crimes against the elderly and has become a recognized expert in investigating and preventing predatory behavior targeting seniors. The training programs developed by Martinez and her colleagues emphasize the importance of understanding the unique vulnerabilities faced by elderly residents in rural communities, where isolation and limited resources can make them attractive targets for sophisticated criminals. The programs also stress the need for patience and empathy when working with elderly victims who may be reluctant to report crimes due to embarrassment, fear, or concerns about losing their independence. Detective Torres, who led the investigation that ultimately brought Vance to justice, retired from the Gainesville Police Department in 2024 after a distinguished career spanning nearly 3 decades. In his retirement speech, he reflected on the Vance case as one of the most significant investigations of his career, not because of its complexity, but because of what it taught him about the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Every elderly person who becomes a victim of crime represents a failure of our community to protect someone who has contributed their entire life to making our society better, Torres said. Mrs. Whitman was a teacher who educated thousands of young people over her career. She deserved to feel safe in her own home, and it was our privilege and responsibility to ensure that she could live out her final years with dignity and security. The investigation also led to changes in how telecommunications companies and financial institutions handle suspected elder abuse cases. New protocols were established for recognizing patterns of suspicious activity that might indicate elderly customers are being targeted by predators, and training programs were developed to help employees identify and report potential crimes. The case attracted national attention from advocacy groups focused on protecting elderly Americans, and it was featured in several documentary programs and academic studies examining crimes against vulnerable populations. The methodical nature of Vance's criminal enterprise and the sophisticated surveillance techniques he employed became a case study used by law enforcement agencies across the country. Perhaps most importantly, the Vance case demonstrated that elderly residents in rural communities don't have to accept victimization as an inevitable consequence of their age or living situation. With proper security measures, community support, and responsive law enforcement, seniors can maintain their independence while significantly reducing their risk of becoming victims of crime. The security improvements installed at Mrs. Whitman's home after the incident became a model for other elderly residents in the area. The system included motion-activated lighting, security cameras with remote monitoring capabilities, and an emergency alert system that could summon help even if phone service was disrupted. These measures, combined with regular check-ins from neighbors and law enforcement, allowed Mrs. Whitman to continue living independently until her death. In the years following Vance's conviction, several other elderly residents in the Archer Road area reported suspicious activity to police, demonstrating that the community had learned to be more vigilant without becoming paranoid. In each case, officers responded quickly and thoroughly, and while most incidents turned out to be false alarms or minor issues, the rapid response sent a clear message that crimes against elderly residents would not be tolerated. The Vance case also influenced policy discussions at the state and federal level about protecting vulnerable populations from predatory crime. Legislation was proposed to increase penalties for crimes specifically targeting elderly victims and to provide additional funding for law enforcement training and community protection programs. For Mrs. Whitman's family, the successful resolution of the case provided closure and peace of mind during her final years. Her great-niece, who inherited the property, often speaks about how grateful the family was for the dedication and professionalism of the officers who protected Mrs. Whitman and brought her attacker to justice. Aunt Eleanor was able to live her final years without fear, knowing that someone cared enough to take her seriously when she called for help, the great-niece said during a community meeting honoring the officers involved in the case. She often said that Officer Martinez and Detective Torres gave her back her sense of safety and allowed her to stay in the home she loved until the end of her life. The legacy of the Vance investigation continues to influence law enforcement practices throughout Florida and beyond. The case serves as a reminder that behind every 911 call is a human being who deserves protection and respect, regardless of their age or circumstances. It demonstrates that thorough investigation and interagency cooperation can prevent serious crimes and bring dangerous predators to justice before they can claim additional victims. Today, when new officers join the Gainesville Police Department, they study the Vance case as part of their training in community policing and crimes against vulnerable populations. They learn about the importance of taking every call seriously, conducting thorough investigations, and building partnerships with community members who can provide crucial information about suspicious activity. The case also serves as an example of how rural law enforcement agencies can work together effectively to address crimes that cross jurisdictional boundaries. The multi-agency task force that apprehended Vance became a model for similar cooperative efforts throughout the region, demonstrating that small departments can pool their resources and expertise to tackle sophisticated criminal enterprises. As Officer Martinez often tells new recruits during training sessions, the Vance case taught us that there's no such thing as a routine call when someone's safety is at stake. Mrs. Whitman's courage in calling 911 and her detailed observations of the suspicious activity gave us the information we needed to stop a dangerous predator. But if we hadn't taken her seriously and conducted a thorough investigation, he would have completed his crime and moved on to other victims. The case continues to resonate with law enforcement professionals who understand that protecting vulnerable community members is one of the most important responsibilities of police work. It serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most significant victories in law enforcement come not from solving crimes after they occur, but from preventing them before they can cause irreparable harm to innocent people. In rural communities throughout Florida, elderly residents continue to live independently and safely, protected by the vigilance of their neighbors and the dedication of law enforcement officers who understand that every person deserves to feel secure in their own home. The Vance case stands as a testament to what can be accomplished when communities and police work together to protect those who need protection most, ensuring that age and isolation do not make anyone an easy target for those who would do them harm. The summer heat was unusually oppressive for Portland as Detective Michael Chen pulled into the parking lot of Riverside Gardens Apartments, a sprawling complex in southeast Portland that housed over 400 residents in what had once been considered affordable housing. The concrete buildings, constructed in the 1970s during an urban renewal project, showed their age in the cracked sidewalks, faded paint, and outdated security systems that barely functioned in the best of circumstances. But today, Detective Chen wasn't here about the building's deteriorating infrastructure, or the usual complaints about noise and petty theft that characterized most apartment complex investigations. He was here because people were disappearing. The call had come in at 2:17 p.m. from the apartment complex's property manager, Rebecca Lawson, a 43-year-old former social worker who had taken the job 3 years earlier, hoping to make a difference in the lives of low-income residents. Her voice on the 911 call had carried a note of barely controlled panic, as she explained that 5 tenants had seemingly vanished over the past 10 days, leaving behind all their possessions, unpaid rent, and no forwarding addresses. "This isn't normal," Lawson had told the dispatcher, her voice echoing through the Portland Police Bureau's Central Dispatch Center. "These aren't people who just pack up and leave without notice. Mrs. Rodriguez in 4B has lived here for 8 years and never missed a rent payment. Mr. Jackson in 2A is disabled and receives all his mail here. They didn't just decide to move without telling anyone. Something's wrong here, and I need someone to take this seriously." Detective Chen had been assigned the case because of his experience with missing persons investigations, particularly those involving vulnerable populations who might not receive adequate attention from overworked patrol officers. At 37, Chen had spent 12 years with the Portland Police Bureau, the last 5 specializing in cases involving homeless individuals, mentally ill persons, and others who often fell through the cracks of the social safety net. As he walked across the parking lot toward the main office, Chen could feel the weight of the complex's problems pressing down on him like the oppressive heat. Riverside Gardens had been built with good intentions during Portland's urban renewal efforts of the 1970s, designed to provide affordable housing for working families and seniors. But decades of deferred maintenance, inadequate funding, and the changing demographics of poverty had transformed it into something closer to a warehouse for society's most vulnerable members. The complex consisted of 4 three-story buildings, arranged around a central courtyard that had once featured a playground and community garden, but now contained little more than cracked concrete and overgrown weeds. Each building housed approximately 100 units, ranging from studio apartments for single residents to 3-bedroom units for families. The tenant population was a mix of elderly residents on fixed incomes, disabled individuals receiving government assistance, working poor families struggling to afford Portland's rising housing costs, and recent immigrants still navigating the American social services system. Rebecca Lawson met Chen at the main office, a cramped space in the ground floor of Building A that served as both her workspace and the unofficial community center for residents who needed help navigating bureaucracy or resolving conflicts with neighbors. Lawson was a compact woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing jeans and a Portland State University t-shirt that had seen better days. Her desk was covered with tenant files, maintenance requests, and social services pamphlets, reflecting her dual role as property manager and informal social worker for the complex's residents. "Thank you for coming," Lawson said as she shook Chen's hand, her grip firm despite the obvious stress she was experiencing. "I've been managing this property for 3 years, and I've never seen anything like this. People here don't just disappear. Most of our residents have been here for years, and even when they do move, they give notice and arrange for their mail to be forwarded. This is completely different." Chen settled into a folding chair across from Lawson's desk and opened his notebook, preparing to document what might become one of the most unusual missing persons cases of his career. "Tell me about the 5 residents who have disappeared. When did you first notice they were missing?" Lawson pulled out a manila folder containing tenant information and began reading from her notes. "The first one I noticed was Mrs. Elena Rodriguez in apartment 4B. She's 72 years old, a retired housekeeper who moved here 8 years ago after her husband died. She's never missed a rent payment, never caused any problems, and she picks up her mail every single day at exactly 10 a.m. When she didn't pick up her mail for 3 days straight, I went to check on her." Chen made notes as Lawson continued, recognizing the type of tenant she was describing. Elderly, routine-oriented, the kind of person whose absence would be noticed quickly by anyone paying attention. What did you find when you checked on her? Her apartment was completely normal, Lawson replied, consulting her notes. All her furniture was there. Her clothes were still in the closet. There was food in the refrigerator that was starting to spoil. Her purse was sitting on the kitchen table with her wallet, credit cards, and over $200 in cash. The door was locked from the outside, and there was no sign of any struggle or forced entry. Chen raised an eyebrow at this detail. People didn't typically abandon cash and credit cards when they left voluntarily, and the locked door suggested that Mrs. Rodriguez had either left on her own or had been removed by someone with access to her keys. Did she have any family or friends who might know where she went? That's what makes this so strange, Lawson said, shaking her head. Mrs. Rodriguez was very social. She participated in our senior activities program, helped organize potluck dinners, and knew most of the other elderly residents in the complex. If she was planning to move or visit family, she would have told someone. She's the type of person who announces when she's going to the grocery store. Chen asked for a list of Mrs. Rodriguez's friends and acquaintances in the complex, thinking that someone might have information about her plans or state of mind before she disappeared. As Lawson compiled the list, she continued describing the other missing residents. The second person I noticed was gone was Marcus Jackson in apartment 2A. He's 46 years old, disabled veteran who receives disability payments, and has all his mail delivered here because he doesn't have family or close friends. He's been here for 5 years and follows a very regular routine. Grocery shopping on Tuesdays, doctor's appointments on Thursdays, and he always pays his rent in person on the first of every month with a money order from the check-cashing place down the street. Chen continued taking notes, recognizing another pattern of routine and predictability that would make a disappearance immediately noticeable. When did you realize he was missing? When he didn't come to pay his rent on June 1st, Lawson replied. I waited 2 days because sometimes people have emergencies or transportation problems, but when I went to his apartment, I found the same thing. Everything was there, no signs of struggle, door locked from the outside. His disability check was still in his mailbox, which he never would have left there. He always cashes it immediately because he needs the money for food and medications. The pattern was beginning to concern Chen. 2 vulnerable residents, both with predictable routines, both leaving behind valuable items and important mail. It suggested either a remarkable coincidence or something more sinister. Tell me about the other 3. Lawson flipped through her notes, her expression growing more troubled as she recounted each case. The third was Jennifer Walsh, 28 years old, single mother with a 6-year-old daughter named Emma. Jennifer works 2 jobs, housekeeping at a downtown hotel during the day and stocking shelves at a grocery store 3 nights a week. She's been here for 2 years and is one of our most responsible tenants. Chen's concern deepened at the mention of a child. What about the daughter? Is she missing too? That's what's so terrifying, Lawson said, her voice dropping to nearly a whisper. Emma was staying with her grandmother for the week because Jennifer was working extra shifts to save money for school clothes. When the grandmother tried to return Emma on Sunday, there was no answer at the apartment. We found the same thing. Everything left behind, including Emma's toys and clothes, but no sign of Jennifer. Chen felt a chill despite the warm afternoon air. A mother would never voluntarily abandon her child's belongings, especially toys and clothes that would be expensive to replace on a housekeeper's salary. This was beginning to look less like missing persons and more like something much more serious. The 4th person was David Kim, a 24-year-old college student at Portland State University. He's been here for 18 months, very quiet, studies most of the time, and works part-time at the campus library. His rent is paid by his parents in South Korea, and he video calls them every Sunday without fail. When his parents couldn't reach him for 2 weeks, they called the complex and asked me to check on him. Chen noted the international connection, which would complicate the investigation if Kim had left the country voluntarily. But the pattern of abandoned belongings and sudden disappearance without notice was consistent with the other cases. Same situation with his apartment? Identical, Lawson confirmed. Everything there, including his laptop computer and expensive camera equipment that his parents had sent him. His passport was still in his desk drawer, so he didn't leave the country. And his parents were frantic. They said David had never gone more than 3 days without calling them since he moved to the United States. Chen was becoming increasingly convinced that these weren't voluntary disappearances. 5 people from different backgrounds and age groups, all following predictable routines, all vanishing without taking important possessions or making arrangements for their responsibilities. Who was the 5th person? Angela Morrison, 79 years old, retired nurse who moved here 6 months ago after her apartment building in North Portland was sold and converted to condominiums. She's been struggling with the transition, new neighborhood, doesn't know many people yet, dealing with some depression since losing her longtime home. But she's been making an effort to get involved in community activities. This case differed from the others in that Morrison was relatively new to the complex and might have fewer people to notice her absence quickly. How did you realize she was missing? She had signed up to help with our monthly community dinner, which was last Saturday. When she didn't show up and didn't answer her door, I used my master key to check on her. Same thing. Apartment looked completely normal, all her possessions there. No note, no indication of where she might have gone. Chen closed his notebook and looked around the office, trying to process the information he had just received. 5 residents, ranging in age from 24 to 79, from diverse backgrounds and life circumstances, all disappearing over a 10-day period without taking personal belongings or making arrangements for their obligations. The pattern was unprecedented in his experience and suggested something far more serious than a series of unrelated missing persons cases. Ms. Lawson, I need to see all 5 apartments and interview other residents who might have seen or heard anything unusual. This is clearly not a coincidence, and we need to treat this as a potential criminal investigation from this point forward. Lawson led Chen through the complex toward Building B, where Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment was located. As they walked, she provided additional context about the complex's security measures and recent changes that might be relevant to the investigation. We don't have security cameras in the buildings or parking lots, Lawson explained. Anticipating one of Chen's questions, the property management company has been promising to install them for years, but they keep saying the budget doesn't allow for it. We have key card access to the main entrances of each building, but the system is old and unreliable. Sometimes the cards don't work, and people prop the doors open for convenience. Chen noted the security vulnerabilities, which would make it easier for someone to enter the buildings without being detected or recorded. What about visitors? Do you have any system for tracking who comes and goes? Not really, Lawson admitted. Residents are supposed to sign in guests at the office, but most people don't bother unless they're having a party or something that might disturb neighbors. We get a lot of social workers, healthcare providers, food delivery people, maintenance workers. It would be impossible to track everyone who enters the complex on any given day. They entered Building B through a side door that required a key card, but Chen noticed that the magnetic lock was damaged and the door could be easily pushed open without a card. The hallway inside was dimly lit and showed signs of deferred maintenance, worn carpeting, peeling paint, and several burned-out light bulbs that hadn't been replaced. Mrs. Rodriguez's apartment was on the 4th floor, and Chen noted that the elevator was out of order, requiring them to climb stairs that were poorly lit and would provide concealment for anyone who wanted to move through the building undetected. The building's layout was typical of 1970s public housing: long corridors with apartments on both sides, few windows, and limited sight lines that would make it difficult for residents to observe suspicious activity. Apartment 4B was at the end of the corridor, and Lawson used her master key to open the door. Chen was immediately struck by how normal everything appeared. The small one-bedroom apartment was clean and well organized, with family photographs covering the walls and furniture that was old but well maintained. Mrs. Rodriguez's bed was made, her dishes were washed and put away, and her medications were lined up on the kitchen counter in a weekly pill organizer. "Has anything been disturbed since you discovered she was missing?" Chen asked as he examined the apartment. "I haven't touched anything except to check the refrigerator and throw away the spoiled food," Lawson replied. "Everything else is exactly as I found it." Chen methodically searched the apartment, looking for any clues about Mrs. Rodriguez's disappearance. Her purse was indeed on the kitchen table, containing $237 in cash, credit cards, identification, and a small address book with phone numbers for family members and friends. Her television was still programmed to her favorite Spanish-language channel, and there was a library book on the coffee table that was due to be returned the day after she disappeared. Most telling was the absence of any indication that Mrs. Rodriguez had been planning to leave. Her suitcases were in the bedroom closet, her passport was in a jewelry box on her dresser, and her monthly bus pass was still in her purse. On her refrigerator was a handwritten calendar showing appointments for the week she disappeared: a doctor's visit, a hair appointment, and a note reminding herself to call her daughter in California. Chen photographed everything with his digital camera and made detailed notes about the apartment's condition. He then asked Lawson to show him the other apartments, hoping to identify any patterns or clues that might explain what had happened to the missing residents. Marcus Jackson's apartment in Building A was similarly undisturbed. The one-bedroom unit was spartanly furnished but organized, reflecting the disciplined habits of someone with military experience. Chen found Jackson's medications on the bathroom counter, including prescriptions for PTSD and chronic pain that would be dangerous to stop taking abruptly. His disability benefit check was still in his mailbox, and his wallet was on the dresser with $89 in cash and his veteran's ID card. Jennifer Walsh's apartment in Building C told a more complex story. The two-bedroom unit showed the organized chaos of a working single mother. Children's toys in the living room, work uniforms hanging in the bedroom, school papers and art projects covering the refrigerator. Emma's bedroom contained enough clothes and toys to make it clear that Jennifer would never have left voluntarily without her daughter. Chen was particularly struck by the evidence of Jennifer's efforts to build a better life for her family. Community college textbooks were stacked on the kitchen table, and a laptop computer was open to an online course in hotel management. On her nightstand was a notebook containing her work schedules and childcare arrangements, meticulously planned weeks in advance. This was not someone who would disappear impulsively. David Kim's studio apartment in Building D reflected the life of a serious student. The space was cramped but efficiently organized, with textbooks and research materials covering every available surface. His computer was still logged into his student email account, and Chen could see unread messages from professors and classmates asking about missed classes and assignment deadlines. Kim's parents had been calling repeatedly, and his phone showed dozens of missed calls and increasingly frantic text messages. Angela Morrison's apartment presented a slightly different picture. The one-bedroom unit was partially unpacked, with boxes of personal belongings still stacked in the corners 6 months after her move. But Chen could see evidence of her efforts to establish a new life. A small garden started on the balcony, community center flyers on the refrigerator, and photographs from the previous apartment carefully arranged on the dresser. After examining all 5 apartments, Chen sat down with Lawson in the complex's community room to interview other residents and staff members who might have relevant information. The community room was a large space that served multiple functions: exercise area, meeting room, children's play area, and informal social center where residents gathered to watch television or play cards. Chen's first interview was with Maria Santos, a 64-year-old resident who had been Mrs. Rodriguez's closest friend in the complex. Santos spoke with a heavy accent but was articulate and observant, providing details about Mrs. Rodriguez's routine and social interactions that helped Chen understand the missing woman's life and mindset. "Elena was very happy here," Santos told Chen in English, mixed with occasional Spanish phrases. "She had her routine, her friends, her church on Sundays. She was not depressed, not worried about anything. She was planning to visit her daughter in California next month and had already bought the plane ticket." Chen asked about any unusual people or activities that Santos might have observed around the time of Mrs. Rodriguez's disappearance. Santos thought carefully before responding, clearly wanting to be helpful while not wanting to make unfounded accusations. "There was a man I didn't recognize who was in the building several times in the past few weeks," Santos said. "He said he was from social services, checking on elderly residents, but he asked strange questions about who lived alone, who had family nearby, who might not be missed immediately if something happened to them." This was the first concrete lead Chen had received, and he pressed Santos for more details about the man's appearance and behavior. She described him as white, probably in his 30s, wearing business casual clothing and carrying a clipboard and official-looking identification. He had visited several apartments in Building B, claiming to be conducting wellness checks on elderly residents. "What made his questions seem strange?" Chen asked. "He wasn't asking about health problems or whether people needed help with shopping or medications," Santos explained. "He was asking about family contacts, whether people had visitors regularly, whether they were involved in community activities where they would be missed. It felt like he was cataloging us, not trying to help us." Chen felt his investigative instincts sharpening as Santos provided more details about the man's behavior. She had observed him watching the building's entrance and exits, noting what time residents came and went, and asking maintenance workers about which apartments were occupied by single residents with no regular visitors. "Did you see him around the times when any of the other residents disappeared?" "I think so," Santos said, her expression growing more concerned as she made the connection. "I saw him talking to Mr. Jackson in the lobby about a week before Mr. Jackson disappeared, and I'm pretty sure I saw him near Building C around the time when Jennifer stopped coming to pick up her mail." Chen asked Santos to work with a police sketch artist to create a composite drawing of the suspicious man, and he made a note to interview maintenance workers and other staff members who might have interacted with him. He also requested that Lawson provide him with security card access logs for the past month, hoping to identify any patterns in building access that might be relevant to the investigation. His next interview was with Robert Chen, no relation, a maintenance worker who had been employed at the complex for 7 years and knew most of the residents by sight. Robert was a quiet man in his 50s who took pride in his work and paid attention to the daily rhythms of life in the complex. "I noticed that guy Maria was talking about," Robert told Detective Chen. "He said he was from the county health department doing follow-up visits for elderly residents who had been in the hospital recently. But something about him didn't seem right." Chen asked Robert to elaborate on his suspicions about the man's legitimacy. "Real social workers and health department people usually coordinate with the office before they start visiting residents," Robert explained. "They don't just show up and start knocking on doors, and they usually have better identification than just a laminated card that could have been made anywhere." Robert also provided information about the complex's security vulnerabilities that Chen was beginning to realize made it an ideal hunting ground for someone preying on vulnerable residents. The key card system was frequently malfunctioning. Residents often propped doors open for convenience, and the lack of security cameras meant that someone could move through the buildings largely undetected. The biggest problem is that we get so many legitimate visitors. Social workers, healthcare providers, food delivery, maintenance contractors, that residents are used to seeing unfamiliar people in the hallways, Robert said. Someone who looked official and acted like they belonged could probably access any apartment in the complex without raising suspicions. Chen's investigation was interrupted by a call from the Portland Police Bureau's Missing Persons Unit supervisor, Lieutenant Sarah Williams, who had been monitoring the case and was concerned about its unusual nature. Williams had reviewed Chen's initial reports and wanted to discuss escalating the investigation to involve additional resources and specialized units. 5 missing persons from the same location in 10 days is unprecedented, Williams told Chen over the phone. I'm assigning 2 additional detectives to work with you, and I want you to coordinate with our Human Trafficking Unit and the FBI's Violent Crimes Task Force. This pattern suggests organized criminal activity, possibly human trafficking or serial predation. The mention of human trafficking sent a chill through Chen as he considered the vulnerability of the missing residents. Elderly people, disabled individuals, single mothers, and international students were all populations that human traffickers specifically targeted because they were less likely to be immediately missed and had fewer resources to resist or escape. Chen spent the remainder of the afternoon conducting additional interviews with residents and staff members, gradually building a picture of systematic surveillance and predatory behavior that had been occurring at Riverside Gardens for several weeks before the disappearances began. Multiple residents reported encounters with individuals claiming to represent various government agencies or social service organizations, all asking questions that seemed designed to identify vulnerable residents who lived alone and had minimal social connections. Detective Angela Rodriguez, who would later note the irony of sharing a surname with one of the missing residents, arrived at the complex in the early evening to assist with the investigation. Rodriguez was a specialist in human trafficking cases and brought expertise in recognizing the patterns and methods used by traffickers to identify and acquire victims. What you're describing fits the profile of traffickers who specialize in acquiring victims for forced labor or sexual exploitation, Rodriguez told Chen as they reviewed the case file. They often target low-income housing complexes because residents are vulnerable and transient, and disappearances might be attributed to people moving voluntarily rather than being taken against their will. Rodriguez explained that human trafficking operations often employed individuals who posed as social workers, health department officials, or other legitimate authorities to gain access to potential victims and gather intelligence about their living situations and social connections. The questions that Santos and other residents had described about family contacts, social isolation, and routine activities were consistent with trafficking reconnaissance. Chen and Rodriguez decided to expand their investigation beyond Riverside Gardens to determine if similar disappearances had occurred at other low-income housing complexes in Portland. They contacted the missing persons units in surrounding jurisdictions and discovered a disturbing pattern of unexplained disappearances from similar housing complexes across the metropolitan area. Over the past 6 months, 17 people had disappeared from low-income apartment complexes in Portland and its suburbs under circumstances similar to those at Riverside Gardens. The victims included elderly residents, disabled individuals, single parents, and immigrants, all populations that traffickers specifically targeted for their vulnerability and social isolation. The Portland Police Bureau immediately established a task force to investigate what was clearly an organized criminal enterprise operating across multiple jurisdictions. The task force included detectives from Portland and suburban police departments, FBI agents specializing in human trafficking, and specialists from the U.S. Attorney's Office who would handle federal prosecution if the investigation confirmed interstate trafficking activity. FBI Special Agent Catherine Morrison, who had been investigating human trafficking networks throughout the Pacific Northwest, was assigned to lead the federal component of the investigation. Morrison brought resources and expertise that local law enforcement lacked, including access to federal databases and surveillance capabilities that could track suspects across state lines. Based on the pattern of disappearances and the methods described by witnesses, we're likely dealing with a sophisticated trafficking organization that has been operating in this region for several months, Morrison told the task force during their first briefing. The systematic nature of the surveillance and the targeting of specific vulnerable populations suggests this is not the work of amateur criminals, but rather an established network with experience in acquiring and transporting victims. Morrison explained that human trafficking operations in the Pacific Northwest often moved victims to other states or regions where they would be less likely to be recognized or rescued. The missing residents from Riverside Gardens could be anywhere in the country by now, making their recovery extremely difficult without identifying and dismantling the entire criminal network. The task force's investigation expanded rapidly as they coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the West Coast to identify similar patterns of disappearances and share intelligence about suspected trafficking operations. They also worked with social service agencies and nonprofit organizations that served vulnerable populations to educate them about the warning signs of trafficking recruitment and to establish protocols for reporting suspicious activity. Meanwhile, Chen continued his investigation at Riverside Gardens, focusing on identifying the individuals who had been conducting surveillance and recruitment activities at the complex. Working with the police sketch artist and witness descriptions, he developed composite drawings of 3 suspects who had been observed in the complex over the past 2 months. The breakthrough in the case came when maintenance worker Robert Chen mentioned that he had seen one of the suspects loading large pieces of furniture into a van behind Building C on the same day that Jennifer Walsh disappeared. Robert had assumed it was a resident moving out, but the timing now seemed significant. It was a white cargo van with some kind of business logo on the side, Robert told Chen. The guy was loading what looked like a couch and some boxes, and he seemed to be in a hurry. When I asked if he needed help, he said he was fine and drove away quickly. Chen immediately contacted the property management company to determine if any residents had scheduled furniture removals on that date and found that no legitimate moving activities had been authorized. This suggested that the van might have been used to remove evidence from Jennifer Walsh's apartment or to transport her belongings as part of covering up her disappearance. The investigation team canvassed businesses in the area surrounding Riverside Gardens, looking for security cameras that might have captured images of the suspicious van or its occupants. They found several cameras at nearby businesses that had recorded vehicles matching Robert's description on the days when residents disappeared from the complex. FBI analysts enhanced the security camera footage and were able to identify partial license plate numbers and clearer images of the van's occupants. The license plate led them to a rental company in southeast Portland, and surveillance of the rental location revealed that the van was being used by individuals who appeared to be conducting similar surveillance activities at other low-income housing complexes. Federal investigators obtained warrants to place tracking devices on the van and to conduct electronic surveillance of the suspect's communications, hoping to identify the full scope of the trafficking operation and locate the missing victims. The investigation revealed a sophisticated criminal network that had been operating throughout the Pacific Northwest for over 2 years, with connections to trafficking organizations in California, Nevada, and Arizona. The network specialized in acquiring vulnerable individuals from low-income housing complexes, homeless encampments, and social service agencies, using a combination of deception, coercion, and outright kidnapping to transport victims to locations where they were forced into labor or sexual exploitation. The organization had developed detailed procedures for identifying targets, conducting surveillance, and removing victims without detection. FBI surveillance teams observed the suspects conducting reconnaissance at 3 additional apartment complexes in Portland, apparently preparing to acquire more victims. The decision was made to arrest the suspects before they could complete their operations, even though it meant potentially losing the opportunity to follow them to the locations where previous victims were being held. The arrests took place simultaneously at dawn on June 18th, 15 days after the first disappearances were reported at Riverside Gardens. FBI tactical teams arrested 5 suspects at various locations around Portland, seizing vehicles, surveillance equipment, false identification documents, and detailed records of their criminal activities. The suspects included Robert Martinez, a 34-year-old former social worker who had been using his knowledge of social services systems to gain access to vulnerable populations; Angela Thompson, a 29-year-old woman who posed as a health department official to conduct reconnaissance; David Sullivan, a 42-year-old man with a criminal history of fraud and identity theft, who coordinated the logistics of transporting victims; Maria Gonzalez, a 36-year-old woman who had been responsible for maintaining surveillance records and coordinating with trafficking networks in other states; and James Wilson, a 38-year-old man who handled the financial aspects of the operation and arranged for the sale of victims to other criminal organizations. The evidence seized during the arrests included detailed files on hundreds of potential victims, including all 5 missing residents from Riverside Gardens, surveillance photographs and videos, communication records with trafficking networks across the western United States, and financial records showing payments received for delivering victims to other criminal organizations. Most importantly, investigators found documents indicating the locations where victims were being held, including safe houses in Oregon, California, and Nevada. FBI tactical teams immediately raided these locations in coordinated operations designed to rescue victims before they could be moved to other locations. The raids resulted in the rescue of 43 trafficking victims, including 4 of the 5 missing residents from Riverside Gardens. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, Marcus Jackson, Jennifer Walsh, and David Kim were found at different locations but were alive and received immediate medical attention and counseling services. Angela Morrison, the elderly former nurse, had been transported to a location in Arizona and was rescued 3 days later during a follow-up operation. The rescued victims were in various states of physical and psychological trauma, having been subjected to forced labor, sexual exploitation, and psychological manipulation designed to break their will to resist or escape. Medical examinations revealed evidence of physical abuse, malnutrition, and untreated medical conditions, but all 5 residents were expected to recover with appropriate treatment and support. The investigation revealed that the trafficking network had been responsible for the disappearances of over 200 individuals across the Pacific Northwest over the past 3 years, generating millions of dollars in profits for the criminal organization. Victims had been forced to work in agricultural operations, manufacturing facilities, domestic service, and commercial sexual exploitation, with their identification documents confiscated to prevent escape. The federal prosecution of the trafficking network involved charges under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the Mann Act, and various federal conspiracy and racketeering statutes. The 5 suspects arrested in Portland faced potential life sentences without parole, and additional arrests were made as the investigation expanded to include the network's operations in other states. For the residents of Riverside Gardens, the resolution of the case brought relief, but also lasting trauma and changes to their sense of security. Property management implemented extensive security improvements, including surveillance cameras, enhanced keycard systems, visitor registration procedures, and coordination with law enforcement to prevent similar crimes in the future. Rebecca Lawson, the property manager whose persistence in reporting the disappearances had initiated the investigation, was recognized by the Portland Police Bureau and the FBI for her role in uncovering the trafficking operation. Her attention to her residents' welfare and her refusal to accept easy explanations for their disappearances had been crucial to identifying the criminal activity and rescuing the victims. Rebecca Lawson saved lives through her diligence and her genuine care for the people she served, FBI Special Agent Morrison said during a community meeting held after the case was resolved. If she hadn't insisted that something was wrong and demanded a thorough investigation, these 5 individuals might never have been found, and the trafficking network would have continued to prey on vulnerable people throughout our region. The case also led to significant changes in how social service agencies and housing providers approach security and resident protection. Training programs were developed to help staff members recognize signs of trafficking recruitment, and protocols were established for verifying the credentials of individuals claiming to represent government agencies or social service organizations. Detective Chen, who had led the initial investigation, was promoted to the Human Trafficking Unit and continued to work on similar cases throughout the Pacific Northwest. He frequently spoke at conferences and training sessions about the importance of taking missing persons reports seriously, particularly when they involved vulnerable populations who might be targeted by traffickers. The Riverside Gardens case taught us that human trafficking doesn't only happen to runaway teenagers or undocumented immigrants, Chen told audiences at law enforcement training sessions. Traffickers target anyone who is vulnerable and isolated, including elderly people, disabled individuals, and working families who are struggling financially. We have to be vigilant about protecting all members of our communities. The 5 rescued residents faced long and difficult recoveries from their traumatic experiences. Mrs. Rodriguez returned to her apartment at Riverside Gardens with enhanced security measures and regular check-ins from social workers and law enforcement. Marcus Jackson was relocated to a veterans housing facility with specialized support services for trauma recovery. Jennifer Walsh was reunited with her daughter, Emma, and received counseling and financial assistance to help rebuild their lives. David Kim completed his education at Portland State University and became an advocate for human trafficking awareness, particularly focusing on the vulnerabilities faced by international students. Angela Morrison moved to an assisted living facility where she could receive the medical and psychological support she needed while maintaining her independence and dignity. The investigation also revealed the broader scope of human trafficking in the Pacific Northwest and led to the establishment of enhanced law enforcement cooperation and victim services throughout the region. The Pacific Northwest Human Trafficking Task Force, formed in response to the Riverside Gardens case, has since rescued hundreds of additional victims and disrupted numerous trafficking operations. For Detective Chen, the case represented both a professional triumph and a sobering reminder of the hidden vulnerabilities that exist within urban communities. We like to think that people disappear for comprehensible reasons. They move away, they have family emergencies, they make poor choices, he reflected during an interview marking the first anniversary of the investigation. But sometimes people disappear because predators are systematically hunting them, and if we don't pay attention to the patterns, we become complicit in their victimization. The Riverside Gardens case continues to be studied by law enforcement agencies and social service organizations as an example of how routine missing persons reports can reveal sophisticated criminal enterprises, and how the persistence of caring community members can make the difference between justice and tragedy. The case serves as a reminder that in an interconnected world where vulnerable people can be easily isolated and exploited, vigilance and compassion are essential tools for protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Today, Riverside Gardens remains a low-income housing complex serving vulnerable populations, but with enhanced security measures and strong partnerships with law enforcement and social service agencies. The community room where Detective Chen conducted his first interviews now displays a memorial to trafficking victims and serves as a meeting space for support groups and educational programs about personal safety and human trafficking awareness. The case file for the Riverside Gardens investigation has become required reading for new detectives in the Portland Police Bureau's Human Trafficking Unit, serving as both a textbook example of thorough investigative work and a reminder of the human cost of organized crime. Most importantly, it demonstrates that behind every missing person report is an individual whose life matters, and whose disappearance deserves the full attention and resources of law enforcement, regardless of their social status or economic circumstances. For Rebecca Lawson, who still manages the Riverside Gardens complex, the case reinforced her belief that housing providers have responsibilities that extend beyond collecting rent and maintaining buildings. "We are not just managing properties," she often tells other property managers during training sessions. "We're managing communities, and that means paying attention to our residents' welfare and being willing to ask difficult questions when something doesn't seem right." The investigation had also revealed systemic vulnerabilities in how society protects its most vulnerable members. The trafficking network had specifically targeted low-income housing complexes, because they understood that disappearances from these communities were less likely to receive immediate attention from law enforcement or media coverage. This disparity in response highlighted broader issues of social inequality and the need for enhanced protection of vulnerable populations. In response to these revelations, the Portland City Council established new funding for security improvements at low-income housing complexes and mandated training programs for property managers and social service workers on recognizing signs of human trafficking. The federal government also increased funding for anti-trafficking initiatives and victim services, recognizing that the problem was far more widespread than previously understood. The psychological impact of the case extended beyond the direct victims to include the entire Riverside Gardens community. Many residents reported feeling unsafe and suspicious of unfamiliar visitors, while others expressed guilt about not noticing the disappearances sooner or not recognizing the signs of predatory surveillance. Community support groups were established to help residents process their trauma and develop strategies for maintaining their safety while preserving the social connections that made the complex a community rather than just a collection of apartments. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a trauma psychologist who worked with the rescued victims, noted that the recovery process was complicated by the fact that the victims had been specifically targeted because of characteristics they couldn't change: their age, disability status, immigration status, or economic circumstances. These individuals were victimized not because of choices they made, but because of vulnerabilities that traffickers identified and exploited, Dr. Martinez explained. Recovery involves not only healing from the trauma of trafficking, but also rebuilding a sense of safety in a world where they understand they are seen as targets. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods that modern trafficking operations use to identify and acquire victims. The network had employed data mining techniques to identify potential targets, using public records, social media profiles, and information from social service agencies to build detailed profiles of vulnerable individuals. They had also developed techniques for psychological manipulation that made victims compliant and discouraged them from seeking help or attempting to escape. Detective Rodriguez, who had specialized in human trafficking cases, noted that the Riverside Gardens investigation represented a new evolution in trafficking operations. Traditional trafficking often relied on victims who were already disconnected from society: runaways, undocumented immigrants, people struggling with addiction, she explained. But this network was actively severing victims' connections to their communities by targeting people who were vulnerable, but still integrated into social support systems. The technology used by the trafficking network was also more sophisticated than in previous cases. They had employed encrypted communications, sophisticated surveillance equipment, and detailed record-keeping systems that allowed them to track dozens of potential victims simultaneously. Federal investigators found evidence that the network had been planning to expand their operations nationally, using the methods they had developed in the Pacific Northwest as a model for similar operations in other regions. The prosecution of the trafficking network resulted in federal convictions for all 5 primary suspects, with sentences ranging from 25 years to life imprisonment without parole. The case also led to the indictment of 17 additional individuals in other states who had been part of the broader criminal enterprise. Asset forfeiture proceedings allowed federal authorities to seize millions of dollars in profits from the trafficking operation, with much of the money being allocated to victim services and anti-trafficking programs. The investigation's success was attributed to the coordination between local and federal law enforcement agencies, the persistence of community members who recognized that something was wrong, and the application of advanced investigative techniques to track and disrupt the criminal network. The case became a model for anti-trafficking investigations and led to the development of new protocols for identifying and investigating suspected trafficking operations. For the Portland Police Bureau, the case represented a significant success but also highlighted the need for enhanced training and resources to address human trafficking. The department established a dedicated human trafficking unit with specialized investigators and developed partnerships with federal agencies and nonprofit organizations to improve their ability to identify and rescue trafficking victims. Officer Chen, who had initiated the investigation, was selected to attend federal training programs on human trafficking and became one of the Portland Police Bureau's leading experts on the subject. He frequently worked with other law enforcement agencies to investigate suspected trafficking operations and provided training to officers throughout the Pacific Northwest on recognizing the signs of trafficking activity. The Riverside Gardens case taught me that human trafficking isn't something that happens in other cities or other countries, Chen reflected during a training session for new detectives. It's happening in our communities, to our neighbors, and it's often invisible unless we know what to look for. The difference between a successful investigation and a tragedy can be as simple as taking someone seriously when they say something doesn't seem right. The case also led to significant improvements in interagency communication and information sharing. A regional database was established to track missing persons reports and identify patterns that might indicate trafficking activity, and protocols were developed for coordinating investigations across jurisdictional boundaries. These improvements helped law enforcement agencies identify and disrupt several additional trafficking operations in the years following the Riverside Gardens investigation. The 5 rescued residents each faced unique challenges in rebuilding their lives after their traumatic experiences. Mrs. Rodriguez, despite her advanced age, showed remarkable resilience and became an advocate for elderly safety awareness. She worked with community organizations to educate other seniors about the warning signs of predatory behavior and the importance of staying connected to their communities. Marcus Jackson struggled with PTSD related to both his military service and his trafficking experience, but eventually found stability in the Veterans Housing Facility, where he received specialized support services. He became involved in peer counseling programs and helped other veterans who had experienced trauma understand their rights and access appropriate services. Jennifer Walsh faced the challenge of explaining her absence to her young daughter while rebuilding their sense of security and normalcy. With the help of counseling services and financial assistance from victim compensation programs, she was able to complete her education and eventually became a social worker specializing in helping other trafficking survivors. David Kim completed his degree at Portland State University and used his experience to research the vulnerabilities faced by international students in the United States. His research contributed to new safety protocols at universities across the country and helped identify ways to better protect international students from exploitation and trafficking. Angela Morrison, despite her age and the trauma she had experienced, showed remarkable determination to rebuild her life and maintain her independence. She moved to an assisted living facility where she received the medical and psychological support she needed, and she became involved in advocacy efforts to improve safety and security at senior housing facilities. The broader community response to the Riverside Gardens case included the establishment of new nonprofit organizations focused on trafficking prevention and victim services, increased funding for law enforcement training and equipment, and enhanced cooperation between agencies serving vulnerable populations. The case also sparked academic research into the methods used by traffickers to identify and acquire victims, leading to better understanding of the crime and more effective prevention strategies. 5 years after the investigation, Detective Chen was promoted to lieutenant and became the supervisor of the Portland Police Bureau's Human Trafficking Unit. Under his leadership, the unit expanded its operations and developed innovative approaches to identifying and disrupting trafficking networks before they could acquire victims. The unit's success rate in rescuing victims and prosecuting traffickers became a model for other law enforcement agencies across the country. The Riverside Gardens complex itself underwent significant changes in the years following the investigation. Property management invested in comprehensive security upgrades, including surveillance cameras, enhanced access control systems, and emergency communication devices in every apartment. They also established partnerships with social service agencies to provide residents with better access to support services and resources. More importantly, the complex developed a strong sense of community solidarity and mutual protection among residents. Neighbors looked out for each other more carefully. Residents were more likely to report suspicious activity, and community meetings became forums for sharing safety information and building social connections that made everyone less vulnerable to isolation and exploitation. Rebecca Lawson continued as property manager and became a recognized expert in affordable housing security and resident protection. She frequently spoke at conferences and training sessions for property managers, sharing the lessons learned from the Riverside Gardens case and advocating for enhanced security measures and resident services at low-income housing complexes. The most important thing we learned, Lawson often told audiences, is that security isn't just about locks and cameras. It's about building communities where people know each other, look out for each other, and care enough to ask questions when something seems wrong. The traffickers succeeded initially because they understood that our residents were isolated and vulnerable. We defeated them by creating connections and support systems that made isolation impossible. The case also had lasting impacts on policy at the state and federal levels. Oregon passed new legislation requiring enhanced security measures at low-income housing complexes and mandating training for property managers on recognizing signs of trafficking activity. Federal funding was increased for anti-trafficking programs, and new protocols were established for coordinating investigations across state lines. The investigation's success demonstrated the importance of community-based approaches to preventing human trafficking. Rather than relying solely on law enforcement responses after crimes had been committed, the focus shifted toward building resilient communities where potential victims had strong social connections and support systems that made them less vulnerable to trafficking recruitment. Educational programs were developed for vulnerable populations, teaching them how to recognize trafficking recruitment tactics and providing them with resources for getting help if they were approached by suspected traffickers. These programs were particularly important for elderly residents, disabled individuals, immigrants, and others who were most likely to be targeted by trafficking networks. The Riverside Gardens case became required study material at the FBI Academy and other federal law enforcement training facilities, serving as an example of how local and federal agencies could work together effectively to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises. The investigation techniques developed during the case were incorporated into federal anti-trafficking protocols and shared with law enforcement agencies around the world. For the survivors of the trafficking network, the legal resolution of the case provided some measure of justice, but their recovery continued to be an ongoing process. Support services were provided through a combination of federal victim assistance programs, nonprofit organizations, and community resources, recognizing that healing from trafficking trauma requires comprehensive, long-term support. The case also highlighted the need for enhanced protection of trafficking survivors, as several of the rescued victims received threats from associates of the criminal network who had not been apprehended. Federal marshals provided security for key witnesses during the prosecution, and victim protection programs helped survivors relocate to safe communities where they could rebuild their lives without fear of retaliation. Dr. Martinez, the trauma psychologist who worked with the survivors, noted that the recovery process was often complicated by the fact that trafficking victims had been betrayed by individuals who appeared to be legitimate authority figures. These victims had been approached by people claiming to represent government agencies and social service organizations, she explained. Rebuilding trust in legitimate institutions and service providers was often one of the most challenging aspects of their recovery. The investigation also revealed the international dimensions of human trafficking and the need for enhanced cooperation with law enforcement agencies in other countries. Several of the suspects had connections to trafficking networks in Central America and Asia, and evidence was found of victims being transported across international borders for exploitation in other countries. As a result of these discoveries, the U.S. government enhanced its cooperation with international law enforcement agencies and increased funding for anti-trafficking programs in countries that were sources of trafficking victims. The Riverside Gardens case contributed to a broader understanding of trafficking as a global problem, requiring coordinated international responses. 10 years after the investigation, the 5 rescued residents had all rebuilt their lives and found ways to contribute to anti-trafficking efforts. Their experiences, while traumatic, had given them unique insights into the methods used by traffickers and the needs of trafficking survivors. Several of them became advocates and educators, sharing their stories to help prevent other people from becoming victims. The Riverside Gardens complex became a model for affordable housing security and community building, hosting visitors from around the country who wanted to learn about effective approaches to protecting vulnerable residents. The community room where Detective Chen had conducted his first interviews was converted into a resource center, providing residents with access to social services, legal assistance, and educational programs. The case continued to influence law enforcement training and policy development, serving as a reminder that human trafficking could happen anywhere, and that protecting vulnerable populations required vigilance, compassion, and coordination between multiple agencies and community organizations. Most importantly, it demonstrated that ordinary people like Rebecca Lawson could make extraordinary differences by caring about their communities and refusing to accept easy explanations when something seemed wrong. For Detective Chen, who had initiated the investigation that saved 5 lives and dismantled a major trafficking network, the case remained a defining moment in his career and a source of motivation for continued work in protecting vulnerable populations. Every missing person report represents someone's life, someone's family, someone's future, he often told new investigators. Our job is to make sure that every person who disappears is searched for with the same intensity and resources, regardless of their economic status or social circumstances. The legacy of the Riverside Gardens investigation continues to influence anti-trafficking efforts throughout the United States and internationally. The case demonstrated that sophisticated criminal enterprises could be defeated through the combination of community vigilance, thorough investigation, interagency cooperation, and sustained commitment to protecting society's most vulnerable members. Most importantly, it proved that every person's life has value, and that no one should be forgotten or abandoned when they disappear, regardless of the circumstances that made them vulnerable in the first place. The autumn fog hung thick over Meadowbrook subdivision as Officer Amanda Walsh pulled her patrol car into the empty cul-de-sac of Willowbend Drive, her headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness of suburban Lincoln, Nebraska. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees during the night, and frost covered the manicured lawns and expensive vehicles parked in the driveways of this upper-middle-class neighborhood. At 29, Walsh had been with the Lincoln Police Department for 6 years, mostly working the night shift in areas where the most serious crimes were typically noise complaints and the occasional domestic disturbance. But the call that had brought her to Meadowbrook at 4:47 a.m. was unlike anything she had encountered in her law enforcement career. The 911 dispatch had been confused and fragmentary, with emergency communications supervisor Janet Martinez struggling to make sense of what the caller was reporting. The caller, who identified himself as Dr. Robert Thompson, a 54-year-old cardiologist living at 1247 Willowbend Drive, claimed that he was receiving phone calls from his neighbors describing events that hadn't happened yet. Officer Walsh, the caller, was very specific but also very agitated. Martinez had explained over the radio as Walsh drove through the empty streets toward the subdivision. He says he's been getting calls from at least 6 different neighbors since midnight, all describing emergencies or incidents that he says are impossible because they're talking about things happening during daylight hours, but it's still dark outside. Walsh had initially assumed she was responding to a mental health crisis, possibly someone experiencing a psychotic break or severe sleep deprivation that was causing hallucinations or delusions. Meadowbrook was an affluent neighborhood populated primarily by professionals, doctors, lawyers, engineers, and business executives, who typically didn't generate many police calls. The few times Walsh had been called to the subdivision, it had usually been for alarm malfunctions or complaints about teenagers throwing parties while their parents were out of town. As Walsh parked in front of 1247 Willowbend Drive, she observed a well-maintained 2-story colonial house with expensive landscaping and a 3-car garage. The house was completely dark except for a single light in what appeared to be a front bedroom window. The neighborhood was silent, except for the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional sound of a furnace cycling on in one of the nearby houses. Dr. Thompson answered the door before Walsh had finished climbing the front steps, suggesting he had been watching for her arrival. He was a tall, thin man with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing pajamas and a bathrobe over house slippers. Despite his informal attire, he carried himself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being in control of difficult situations. "Officer, thank you for coming," Dr. Thompson said, his voice carrying the controlled urgency of someone trying to remain calm while dealing with a crisis. "I know this is going to sound impossible, but I need you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because I think something very dangerous is happening in this neighborhood." Walsh followed Dr. Thompson into his living room, which was furnished with expensive but conservative furniture that suggested a successful professional with traditional tastes. Family photographs covered the mantelpiece and side tables, showing Dr. Thompson with his wife and 2 teenage children in various vacation and formal settings. The house had the quiet, orderly atmosphere of a family that valued privacy and stability. "Dr. Thompson, the dispatcher said you've been receiving unusual phone calls," Walsh began, settling into a chair across from the couch where Dr. Thompson had seated himself. "Can you tell me exactly what's been happening?" Dr. Thompson picked up a legal pad covered with handwritten notes and consulted it before responding. At 12:17 a.m., I received a call from Martha Henderson, who lives 3 houses down at 1253 Willowbend. She was crying and said there had been a terrible accident in her backyard, that her husband Harold had fallen from their deck and was unconscious. She begged me to come help because she knew I was a doctor. Walsh made notes as doctor. Thompson continued, recognizing the type of emergency call that neighbors might make to a physician living nearby. Did you go to help? That's where this becomes impossible to explain, Dr. Thompson said, his expression growing more troubled. I immediately got dressed and went to the Henderson house. There was no accident. Harold was asleep in bed, Martha was asleep beside him, and there was nothing wrong with their deck. When I rang the doorbell, Harold answered and said I must have made a mistake, that Martha hadn't called anyone and certainly hadn't called about an accident. Walsh felt a flicker of concern that Dr. Thompson might be experiencing some form of medical emergency that was causing confusion or hallucinations. Is it possible you misunderstood the call, or that Mrs. Henderson called the wrong number? That's what I thought initially, Dr. Thompson replied, consulting his notes again. But then at 1:45 a.m. I received another call, this time from James Morrison at 1261 Willowbend. He was panicked, saying his teenage daughter Sarah was missing, that she had left for school that morning and hadn't come home. He was asking if I had seen her and if I thought he should call the police. Walsh noted the details, beginning to see a pattern that concerned her. Did you check on that situation as well? I walked over to the Morrison house, and again, everything was normal. James Morrison was asleep, his wife was asleep, and I could see their daughter's car in the driveway. When I knocked on the door, Mrs. Morrison answered and said their daughter was asleep upstairs and had been home all evening. She looked at me like I was having some kind of mental breakdown. The pattern was becoming clear to Walsh, and it suggested either a very elaborate prank or someone with serious psychological problems. But Dr. Thompson's manner was calm and rational, and his detailed documentation of the events suggested someone who was trying to understand rather than fabricate what was happening. Dr. Thompson, have you experienced any recent medical issues, changes in medication, or high levels of stress that might be affecting your perception or memory? Officer, I'm a cardiologist with over 20 years of experience. I understand your concern about my mental state, but I need you to consider the possibility that something else is happening here. Dr. Thompson stood up and walked to the window overlooking the street. At 2:33 a.m., I received a call from David Chen at 1239 Willowbend, reporting that someone had broken into his house and stolen his car. At 3:15 a.m., Linda Foster from 1275 Willowbend called saying her house was on fire and begging me to call the fire department. Walsh continued taking notes, but her concern about Dr. Thompson's mental state was growing. And when you investigated these reports, no break-in at the Chen house, no fire at the Foster house, and both families insisted they hadn't made any calls. Dr. Thompson returned to his seat, his expression reflecting frustration and growing fear. But officer, here's what really convinced me that I'm not having a psychological breakdown. At 4:23 a.m., I received a call from Patricia Williams at 1251 Willowbend. She was hysterical, saying that police cars and ambulances were surrounding the Thompson house, my house, and that something terrible had happened to Dr. Thompson and his family. This detail caught Walsh's attention because it suggested a level of specificity that would be unusual in most forms of mental illness or substance-induced hallucinations. What did you do when you received that call? I went outside immediately and looked around the neighborhood. Obviously, there were no police cars or ambulances, and nothing had happened to my family. But when I called Patricia Williams back, there was no answer. When I walked over to her house, it was completely dark and there was no answer when I knocked. Walsh asked Dr. Thompson to provide her with the phone numbers for all the neighbors he claimed had called him, and she used her radio to request that dispatch attempt to contact these individuals to verify their current status and ask about any phone calls they might have made during the night. While waiting for responses, she asked Dr. Thompson to show her his phone's call log to verify the incoming calls he had described. Dr. Thompson's iPhone showed a series of incoming calls corresponding exactly to the times and numbers he had documented in his handwritten notes. Walsh photographed the phone's call log with her own device and noted that the calls had indeed been received from the phone numbers belonging to the neighbors Dr. Thompson had identified. Dispatch reported back that they had been able to reach 4 of the 6 neighbors Dr. Thompson had mentioned. All 4 confirmed that they were safe and at home, that they had not made any emergency calls during the night, and that they had not experienced any of the problems Dr. Thompson described them reporting. 2 of the neighbors could not be reached, but dispatch confirmed that Patricia Williams and Harold Henderson were not answering their phones. Dr. Thompson, I need to ask you some additional questions about your personal and medical history, Walsh said, recognizing that she might be dealing with someone experiencing a complex psychological crisis that required mental health intervention rather than traditional police response. Officer, I understand your skepticism, but I need you to consider one more possibility before you conclude that I'm having a mental breakdown, Dr. Thompson said, his voice taking on a note of urgency. What if someone is deliberately making these calls to harass me or to make me appear unstable? What if this is part of some kind of campaign to damage my reputation or my medical practice? The possibility of harassment or stalking hadn't occurred to Walsh, but it would explain the pattern of calls without requiring her to accept that Dr. Thompson was experiencing severe mental illness. Has anyone threatened you recently, or do you have any conflicts with neighbors, colleagues, or patients that might motivate someone to harass you? Dr. Thompson considered the question carefully before responding. I've been involved in a medical malpractice lawsuit for the past 18 months. A patient died during surgery and the family is suing me and the hospital for negligence. The case has been very stressful and it's received some media attention because the patient was a prominent local businessman. This information provided a potential motive for harassment, and Walsh asked Dr. Thompson for details about the lawsuit and any threats or unusual contact he had received related to the case. As they discussed the legal situation, Walsh's radio crackled with an urgent transmission from dispatch. All units, we have a Code 3 medical emergency at 1251 Willow Bend Drive, Meadowbrook Subdivision. Caller reports an elderly woman collapsed in her home, possible cardiac arrest. EMS is en route. Walsh felt a chill as she realized that 1251 Willow Bend was the address Dr. Thompson had identified as belonging to Patricia Williams, one of the neighbors who had allegedly called him earlier, but whom dispatch had been unable to reach. Dr. Thompson's expression showed that he had made the same connection. Officer, Patricia Williams called me at 4:23 a.m. about police cars and ambulances at my house, Dr. Thompson said, his voice tight with concern. Now there's a real medical emergency at her house. What if she was somehow seeing the future when she called me? Walsh realized that she needed backup and potentially mental health crisis intervention services, but the medical emergency at Patricia Williams's house took priority. She radioed for additional units to respond to Dr. Thompson's address for a welfare check and psychological evaluation, then asked Dr. Thompson to accompany her to the Williams house to see if his medical expertise might be needed. As they walked the 3 blocks to 1251 Willow Bend Drive, Walsh tried to process the strange coincidence of a real emergency occurring at the home of someone who had supposedly made a prophetic phone call hours earlier. The rational explanation was that Dr. Thompson had somehow learned about Patricia Williams's medical emergency through normal means and had incorporated it into his delusional system. But the timing seemed too precise for that theory. The Williams house was a modest ranch-style home, with well-maintained landscaping and an attached garage. As Walsh and Dr. Thompson approached, they could see ambulance lights reflecting off the windows and emergency medical technicians moving equipment into the house. Detective Raymond Santos of the Lincoln Police Department was coordinating with EMS personnel and taking a statement from a neighbor who had discovered Patricia Williams collapsed in her kitchen. "What's the situation?" Walsh asked Detective Santos as they approached the house. 78-year-old female, found unconscious by her neighbor who has a key for emergencies. Santos replied, consulting his notes. Neighbor came to check on her because she hadn't picked up her newspaper or her mail yesterday, which was unusual for her routine. EMTs think it might be a stroke or cardiac event, but she was probably unconscious for at least 12 hours before being found. Walsh felt another chill as she realized that if Patricia Williams had been unconscious for 12 hours, she couldn't have made the phone call to Dr. Thompson at 4:23 a.m. She asked Detective Santos if the neighbor who found Williams had observed any unusual activity at the house during the night, or if Williams had made any phone calls before her medical emergency. The neighbor, Mrs. Garcia from next door, says Williams' house was dark all night, and she's pretty sure Patricia was already unconscious by the time she went to bed around 10 p.m. Santos replied. "Why do you ask?" Walsh explained the situation with Dr. Thompson and the alleged phone calls, including the claim that Patricia Williams had called him hours after she had apparently lost consciousness. Detective Santos listened with growing interest, recognizing that they might be dealing with something more complex than a simple mental health crisis. "Let's check Williams's phone records and see if any calls were made from her house during the night," Santos suggested. If Dr. Thompson is telling the truth about receiving a call from her number, but she was unconscious, then someone else was in her house making calls. The possibility that someone had been in Patricia Williams' house during her medical emergency added a criminal dimension to what Walsh had initially considered a psychological crisis. If Dr. Thompson's account was accurate, it suggested that someone with access to Williams' phone had been making harassing calls to Dr. Thompson while an elderly woman lay unconscious and in need of medical attention. Dr. Thompson accompanied the EMTs to the hospital to assist with Patricia Williams' medical care, while Walsh and Detective Santos began investigating the phone calls he had reported. They obtained emergency warrants for the phone records of all the neighbors Dr. Thompson claimed had called him, looking for evidence of calls made during the times he had documented. The phone records revealed a disturbing pattern that supported Dr. Thompson's account while raising new questions about what was happening in the Meadowbrook subdivision. Calls had indeed been made from the neighbors' phone numbers to Dr. Thompson's number at the exact times he had documented, but the neighbors all insisted they had not made these calls and had been asleep when the calls occurred. Most concerning was the record for Patricia Williams' phone, which showed a call to Dr. Thompson at 4:23 a.m., more than 6 hours after she had likely lost consciousness. The call had lasted 3 minutes and 27 seconds, according to the phone company records, but Williams had been unconscious and alone in her house when the call was allegedly made. Detective Santos coordinated with the crime scene technicians to process Patricia Williams' house for evidence of unauthorized entry or the presence of unknown individuals. The technicians found no signs of forced entry, but they did discover that Williams's phone had been moved from its usual location on her kitchen counter to her bedroom nightstand, where it was found when emergency responders arrived. Either Patricia Williams regained consciousness long enough to move her phone and make a call to Dr. Thompson before collapsing again, or someone else was in her house during her medical emergency, Santos told Walsh as they reviewed the evidence. given her medical condition and the nature of the call Dr. Thompson described, the second option seems more likely. The investigation expanded to include all 6 neighbors who had allegedly called Dr. Thompson during the night. Detectives interviewed each family and conducted security checks of their homes, looking for evidence of unauthorized entry or access to their phones. They also began canvassing the neighborhood for security cameras that might have recorded suspicious activity during the night. The breakthrough in the case came when Detective Santos discovered that 5 of the 6 houses where calls had allegedly originated had been serviced by the same home security company within the past month. Midwest Security Solutions had performed system upgrades and maintenance at these properties, giving their technicians access to the houses and potentially to the residents' personal information. Walsh and Santos obtained warrants to investigate Midwest Security Solutions and interview their employees who had worked in the Meadowbrook subdivision. The company's records showed that technician Marcus Vetter had performed work at all 5 houses where suspicious calls had originated, and that he had access to security codes, alarm systems, and in some cases, spare keys that homeowners provided for emergency access. Background investigation revealed that Marcus Vetter, a 32-year-old former electronics technician, had been terminated from 2 previous security companies for unauthorized access to customer properties and inappropriate conduct during service calls. He had also been involved in several harassment complaints filed by female customers who reported that he had made unwanted contact after completing work at their homes. Most disturbing was the discovery that Vetter had been conducting surveillance of Dr. Thompson for several months as part of an elaborate harassment campaign related to the medical malpractice lawsuit. Vetter's ex-girlfriend was the sister of the patient who had died during Dr. Thompson's surgery, and she had been feeding Vetter information about the lawsuit and encouraging him to find ways to damage Dr. Thompson's reputation and mental stability. The harassment campaign involved Vetter using his access to neighbors' homes and security systems to make phone calls that would appear to come from their numbers, creating confusion and distress for Dr. Thompson while making him appear mentally unstable to anyone who investigated his claims. Vetter had been entering the homes during the late-night hours when residents were asleep, using their phones to make calls to Dr. Thompson describing fictional emergencies and crises. The plan had been to gradually escalate the harassment until Dr. Thompson appeared to be having a complete psychological breakdown, potentially damaging his credibility as a witness in the malpractice lawsuit and as a practicing physician. Vetter had been documenting Dr. Thompson's reactions to the calls and had planned to use this information to support claims that the doctor was mentally unstable and unfit to practice medicine. The situation with Patricia Williams represented an unplanned complication in Vetter's harassment campaign. He had entered her house to make another harassing call to Dr. Thompson, but had discovered that Williams was unconscious and in medical distress. Rather than calling for help immediately, Vetter had proceeded with his planned harassment call before eventually leaving the house without summoning emergency services. Vetter was arrested at his apartment and charged with multiple felonies including breaking and entering, stalking, harassment, identity theft, and endangering the welfare of an elderly person. Evidence seized from his apartment included detailed surveillance records on Dr. Thompson, recordings of the harassing phone calls, and plans for escalating the harassment campaign. The investigation revealed that Vetter had been planning to eventually plant evidence in Dr. Thompson's home or car that would suggest mental illness or substance abuse, potentially destroying his medical career and family relationships. He had also been gathering personal information about Dr. Thompson's family members, apparently planning to expand his harassment to include the doctor's wife and children. Patricia Williams survived her medical emergency, but required extensive hospitalization and rehabilitation. Medical experts testified that the delay in receiving emergency medical care, caused by Vetter's decision to continue his harassment, rather than immediately call for help, had significantly worsened her condition and might have permanent health consequences. During his trial, Vedder showed no remorse for his actions and continued to maintain that Dr. Thompson deserved to be punished for the death of his ex-girlfriend's brother. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in state prison, noting that his actions had endangered multiple innocent people and had perverted the legal system by attempting to interfere with legitimate medical malpractice proceedings. The case had lasting impacts on the Meadowbrook subdivision and the broader Lincoln community. Residents became more aware of the importance of carefully vetting service providers and contractors who requested access to their homes, and many invested in additional security measures to prevent unauthorized entry. Midwest Security Solutions faced civil lawsuits from affected homeowners and was ultimately forced out of business due to the liability associated with their inadequate employee screening procedures. New regulations were implemented requiring background checks and bonding for all employees of security companies who would have access to customer properties. Dr. Thompson continued his medical practice, but never fully recovered from the psychological impact of the harassment campaign. He installed extensive security systems at his home and office and required counseling to deal with the paranoia and anxiety that resulted from months of systematic harassment. The medical malpractice lawsuit was eventually settled out of court, but the harassment campaign had achieved its goal of damaging Dr. Thompson's reputation and emotional well-being. For Officer Walsh, the case represented a significant learning experience about the importance of taking unusual reports seriously and conducting thorough investigations, even when initial explanations seemed to point toward mental health issues. Her persistence in documenting Dr. Thompson's claims and her willingness to consider alternative explanations had been crucial to uncovering the criminal harassment campaign. The Meadowbrook case taught me that sometimes the most bizarre-sounding complaints can have criminal explanations, Walsh told fellow officers during training sessions about the case. If I had dismissed Dr. Thompson as mentally ill without investigating his claims, Marcus Vedder would have continued his harassment campaign, and Patricia Williams might have died without receiving medical attention. Detective Santos used the case as an example of how modern technology could be perverted for criminal purposes and how traditional investigative techniques remained essential for solving complex crimes. The case demonstrated the importance of following evidence wherever it led, even when the initial explanation seemed obvious. We live in an age where people have access to sophisticated technology and information that can be used to commit crimes we never imagined 20 years ago, Santos explained during a law enforcement conference. Home security systems, phone networks, and electronic devices that are supposed to make us safer can be turned into weapons by people with criminal intent and technical knowledge. The case also highlighted the vulnerability of elderly residents living alone, and the importance of community support systems for identifying medical emergencies and ensuring that seniors receive timely assistance. Patricia Williams' near-fatal experience led to the establishment of enhanced welfare check programs and community watch initiatives in Lincoln's residential neighborhoods. For the neighbors in Meadowbrook who had unknowingly been victimized by Vedder's harassment campaign, the case created lasting concerns about privacy and security. Many residents reported feeling violated by the knowledge that someone had been entering their homes while they slept and using their personal property to commit crimes against their neighbor. The legal system's response to the case included enhanced penalties for crimes involving the unauthorized use of electronic communication devices and identity theft related to harassment campaigns. Vedder's prosecution became a model for addressing similar cases involving sophisticated, technology-enabled stalking and harassment. The medical malpractice lawsuit that had motivated the harassment campaign was ultimately resolved through mediation, with all parties acknowledging that the criminal harassment had complicated the legal proceedings and caused additional suffering for everyone involved. Dr. Thompson's experience led to new protocols for protecting medical professionals who were involved in malpractice litigation from retaliation and harassment. 5 years after the incident, Dr. Thompson continued practicing cardiology, but had relocated his practice to a different city to escape the ongoing psychological impact of the harassment campaign. He remained grateful to Officer Walsh and Detective Santos for their thorough investigation and their willingness to take his seemingly impossible claims seriously. If Officer Walsh hadn't believed me and investigated my claims thoroughly, I would probably have ended up in a psychiatric facility while Marcus Vetter continued his harassment campaign, Dr. Thompson said during a victim impact statement at Vetter's sentencing hearing. The fact that she was willing to consider that someone might be deliberately trying to make me appear mentally ill saved not only my sanity, but possibly my career and my family. Patricia Williams recovered most of her physical abilities, but required ongoing medical care related to complications from her delayed treatment. She became an advocate for enhanced welfare check programs for elderly residents and frequently spoke about the importance of community vigilance in protecting vulnerable neighbors. The Meadowbrook case became required study material at the Nebraska Law Enforcement Training Center, serving as an example of how traditional police work could uncover sophisticated criminal schemes that initially appeared to have supernatural or psychological explanations. The case demonstrated the importance of thorough documentation, persistent investigation, and willingness to consider alternative explanations when initial assessments didn't fully explain the available evidence. For Walsh, who was promoted to detective partly based on her handling of the Meadowbrook investigation, the case remained a career-defining experience that influenced her approach to all subsequent investigations. She frequently mentored new officers on the importance of taking all citizen complaints seriously and conducting thorough investigations, even when crimes appeared to have obvious explanations. Police work isn't just about responding to crimes after they happen, Walsh often told new recruits. Sometimes our job is to recognize that what looks like a mental health crisis or a domestic dispute might actually be evidence of a complex criminal scheme. The difference between a good officer and a great officer is the willingness to dig deeper when something doesn't quite make sense. The technological aspects of Vetter's harassment campaign led to enhanced training for law enforcement officers on electronic crimes and the potential criminal uses of home security systems, communication devices, and other modern technology. The case helped law enforcement agencies understand how criminals could exploit the interconnected nature of modern homes and communication systems. Detective Santos retired from the Lincoln Police Department 3 years after the Meadowbrook investigation, but continued working as a consultant on complex harassment and stalking cases. He frequently testified as an expert witness in cases involving technology-enabled crimes and helped develop new investigative protocols for addressing similar incidents. The Meadowbrook case showed us that criminals are adapting to use new technology in ways we hadn't anticipated, Santos explained during a presentation to federal law enforcement agencies. We had to evolve our investigative techniques to address crimes that combined traditional breaking and entering with sophisticated electronic harassment and identity theft. The case also influenced the design and implementation of home security systems, with manufacturers adding features to prevent unauthorized access and to create audit trails for system access and usage. The security industry implemented enhanced background check requirements and ongoing monitoring of employees who had access to customer properties. For the residents of Meadowbrook subdivision, the case created a lasting sense of community solidarity as neighbors realized how easily they could be victimized by someone exploiting their trust in service providers. Community watch programs were strengthened, and residents became more vigilant about verifying the credentials of anyone requesting access to their homes. The psychological impact of the case extended beyond the immediate victims to include the broader community of medical professionals who realized they could be targeted for harassment related to their professional activities. Professional organizations developed new resources for helping physicians and other healthcare providers deal with harassment and threats related to malpractice litigation. Today, more than 5 years after Marcus Vetter's arrest, the Meadowbrook subdivision remains a quiet, affluent neighborhood where the most serious crimes are typically traffic violations and occasional property disputes. But residents still remember the autumn when their community was terrorized by someone who turned their own homes and communication systems into weapons against their neighbor. The case file for the Meadowbrook investigation is stored in the Lincoln Police Department's archives, but it continues to be studied by law enforcement agencies across the country as an example of how sophisticated harassment campaigns can be disguised as mental health crises, and how persistent investigation can uncover criminal schemes that initially seem impossible to explain. For Officer Walsh, now Detective Walsh, the case serves as a daily reminder that law enforcement requires both skepticism and open-mindedness, the ability to question obvious explanations while remaining willing to consider possibilities that might initially seem impossible. Her experience investigating Dr. Thompson's seemingly bizarre claims taught her that sometimes the most important cases are those that don't fit neatly into standard categories of criminal activity. The Meadowbrook case taught me that reality can be stranger than fiction, but it's usually not supernatural, Walsh reflected during a recent interview. When citizens call us with reports that seem impossible, our job isn't to immediately dismiss them as mentally ill or delusional. Our job is to investigate thoroughly and follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it takes us into territory we've never explored before. The legacy of the Meadowbrook investigation continues to influence law enforcement training and community safety programs throughout Nebraska and beyond. The case demonstrates that protecting communities requires vigilance, not only against traditional crimes, but also against new forms of technological exploitation that can turn everyday conveniences into tools for harassment and intimidation. Most importantly, the case serves as a reminder that behind every bizarre police report is a human being who deserves to be taken seriously and protected from harm, regardless of how unlikely their claims might initially appear. Sometimes, the difference between justice and tragedy is simply an officer's willingness to listen carefully and investigate thoroughly, even when doing so requires questioning assumptions about what is possible and what is real. The broader implications of the Meadowbrook case extended far beyond Lincoln, Nebraska, influencing law enforcement practices and community safety initiatives throughout the Midwest and eventually across the nation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation incorporated the case into their training curriculum for agents specializing in stalking and harassment investigations, recognizing it as a textbook example of how modern technology could be weaponized for psychological warfare against targeted individuals. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a forensic psychologist who studied the case extensively, noted that Vetter's harassment campaign represented a new evolution in stalking behavior that combined traditional techniques with sophisticated technological manipulation. What makes the Meadowbrook case so significant? Dr. Mitchell wrote in her analysis published in the Journal of Forensic Psychology, is that it demonstrates how perpetrators can create elaborate false realities for their victims while maintaining plausible deniability and making the victims appear mentally unstable to outside observers. The psychological warfare aspects of Vetter's campaign became a subject of academic study, with researchers examining how systematic reality distortion could be used to undermine a person's credibility and mental stability. The case contributed to new understanding of gaslighting techniques and their potential applications in targeted harassment campaigns, leading to enhanced training for mental health professionals on recognizing when apparent psychological symptoms might actually result from deliberate manipulation rather than organic mental illness. The legal precedents established by Vedder's prosecution influenced legislation in 17 states, leading to enhanced penalties for crimes involving the unauthorized use of electronic communication systems for harassment purposes. The Meadowbrook Protocol, as it became known in legal circles, established guidelines for investigating complaints that appeared to involve impossible or supernatural elements, requiring law enforcement agencies to conduct thorough technical investigations before concluding that complainants were experiencing mental health crises. For the home security industry, the case catalyzed a complete overhaul of employee screening and monitoring procedures. Industry standards were established requiring psychological evaluations, continuous background monitoring, and strict audit trails for all technicians with access to customer properties. Insurance companies began requiring these enhanced security measures as a condition of coverage, effectively forcing the entire industry to adopt higher standards. The technological vulnerabilities exposed by Vedder's methods led to significant improvements in home security system design and implementation. Modern systems now include tamper-evident features, encrypted communication protocols, and comprehensive logging capabilities that make it much more difficult for unauthorized individuals to access or manipulate connected devices without detection. Detective Walsh's career trajectory was significantly influenced by her handling of the Meadowbrook case. She became the Lincoln Police Department's first specialist in technology-enabled crimes, eventually earning a master's degree in digital forensics and becoming a nationally recognized expert in investigating complex harassment and stalking cases. Her testimony has been crucial in prosecuting similar cases across the country, and she has trained thousands of officers in recognizing and investigating technologically sophisticated crimes. The Meadowbrook case taught me that the criminals are always adapting, and we have to adapt with them, Detective Walsh explained during a keynote address at the National Association of Police Chiefs Convention. 20 years ago, a stalker might follow someone or make threatening phone calls. Today, they can turn your entire home into a weapon against you, using the very systems that are supposed to make you feel safe and secure. The case also highlighted the importance of community resilience and neighbor-to-neighbor support systems in preventing and responding to sophisticated criminal activity. The Meadowbrook Neighborhood Association, formed in response to the incident, became a model for community organizing around personal safety and crime prevention. The association developed protocols for verifying service providers, sharing information about suspicious activity, and ensuring that vulnerable residents received regular welfare checks. Patricia Williams, who survived her medical emergency despite the delayed response caused by Vedder's harassment campaign, became a powerful advocate for elderly safety and community vigilance. At 83, she continued to live independently, but with enhanced security measures and regular contact with neighbors and family members. Her experience motivated the establishment of the Patricia Williams Emergency Response Foundation, which provides funding for medical alert systems and welfare check programs for isolated elderly residents throughout Nebraska. "What happened to me could happen to anyone," Williams often told audiences during her speaking engagements about elder safety. The difference between life and death can be a neighbor who pays attention, a security system that works properly, or a police officer who takes the time to investigate when something doesn't seem right. We all have responsibilities to look out for each other. Dr. Thompson eventually relocated his medical practice to Denver, Colorado, seeking a fresh start away from the traumatic memories associated with Lincoln. However, he maintained contact with the Meadowbrook community and frequently returned to speak about the importance of physician safety and the potential consequences of malpractice litigation gone wrong. His experience led to new protocols within medical professional organizations for protecting physicians who become targets of harassment related to patient care outcomes. The medical malpractice case that had originally motivated Vedder's harassment campaign was eventually resolved through a confidential settlement. But the precedent it established influenced how such cases are handled nationwide. Legal professional organizations developed new guidelines for protecting litigation participants from retaliation and harassment, and several states passed legislation making it a specific crime to target attorneys, physicians, or other professionals for harassment related to their legitimate professional activities. Marcus Vedder served 12 years of his 15-year sentence before being released on parole in 2035. His parole conditions included lifetime prohibitions on working in the security industry, accessing home security systems, or having unsupervised contact with elderly individuals. He was also required to participate in ongoing psychological counseling and to submit to regular monitoring of his electronic communications and internet activities. Upon his release, Vedder violated his parole conditions within 6 months by attempting to access his ex-girlfriend's social media accounts and conducting online surveillance of Dr. Thompson's new medical practice in Colorado. He was returned to prison to serve the remainder of his original sentence plus additional time for parole violations, and legal experts predicted that he would likely spend the rest of his life under some form of correctional supervision. The case files from the Meadowbrook investigation have been digitized and made available to law enforcement agencies worldwide through the International Association of Chiefs of Police database, serving as a resource for investigators dealing with similar complex harassment and stalking cases. The detailed documentation of Vedder's methods and the investigative techniques used to uncover his crimes have been credited with helping solve dozens of similar cases across the United States and in several other countries. Detective Santos, who had been instrumental in the technical investigation that exposed Vedder's methods, established a consulting firm specializing in complex criminal investigations involving technology and harassment. His expertise has been sought by law enforcement agencies, corporations, and legal teams dealing with sophisticated criminal schemes that blur the lines between traditional crimes and cyber offenses. The Meadowbrook case was a watershed moment in understanding how criminals adapt to use new technology, Santos reflected during a recent interview marking the 10th anniversary of the investigation. It showed us that we can't just rely on traditional investigative methods when dealing with crimes that involve sophisticated manipulation of electronic systems and communication networks. The broader law enforcement community has recognized the Meadowbrook case as a turning point in understanding the potential for technology to be used as a weapon in personal harassment and stalking cases. The case has been featured in numerous academic studies, law enforcement training programs, and documentary productions examining the intersection of technology and crime. The Netflix documentary series Digital Predators, which premiered in 2033, featured the Meadowbrook case as its premiere episode, bringing national attention to the vulnerability of modern homes and communication systems to criminal exploitation. The series sparked widespread public discussion about personal security and privacy in the digital age, leading to increased consumer demand for enhanced security features and greater awareness of the potential risks associated with connected home devices. For current residents of the Meadowbrook subdivision, the legacy of the case continues to influence their daily lives and community interactions. Property values initially declined following the publicity surrounding the case, but they have since recovered and even exceeded pre-incident levels as the neighborhood's enhanced security measures and strong community bonds have made it an attractive location for safety-conscious families. The house at 1247 Willow Bend Drive, where Dr. Thompson lived during the harassment campaign, has been occupied by 3 different families since his departure. Each new resident has been briefed on the history of the property and the enhanced security measures that were installed following the incident. The current residents, a young professional couple with 2 small children, report feeling safe and secure thanks to the comprehensive security systems and the vigilant neighborhood community. The annual Meadowbrook Community Safety Day, established in 2024, has become a model for neighborhood safety education programs throughout Lincoln and other Nebraska communities. The event features presentations by law enforcement officers, security professionals, and medical personnel, along with demonstrations of home security systems and emergency response procedures. Detective Walsh, now Lieutenant Walsh, and supervisor of the Lincoln Police Department's Special Investigations Unit, continues to use the Meadowbrook case as a teaching tool for new officers and detectives. Her unit handles the most complex and unusual criminal investigations in the Lincoln area, applying the lessons learned from the Meadowbrook case to a wide variety of criminal schemes that involve technology, psychology, and systematic deception. Every time we get a call that seems impossible or bizarre, I think about Dr. Thompson calling 911 to report that his neighbors were calling him about events that hadn't happened yet, Lieutenant Walsh told a recent Academy graduating class. It would have been easy to dismiss him as mentally ill or delusional, but taking the time to investigate thoroughly revealed a sophisticated criminal scheme that could have destroyed multiple lives if left unchecked. The Meadowbrook case continues to influence police academy curricula throughout the United States, serving as a cornerstone example of how thorough investigation and critical thinking can uncover complex criminal schemes that initially appear to have supernatural or psychological explanations. The case demonstrates the importance of maintaining an open mind while applying rigorous investigative techniques to unusual complaints and reports. The technological aspects of the case have also influenced the development of new forensic investigation tools and techniques for analyzing electronic communications and home security systems. The specialized equipment and software developed for investigating vetters' crimes have become standard tools for law enforcement agencies dealing with technology-enabled harassment and stalking cases. As Lieutenant Walsh approaches retirement after a distinguished career largely defined by her handling of the Meadowbrook case, she reflects on the lessons learned and the changes that have occurred in law enforcement since that October morning, when Dr. Thompson called 911 to report receiving impossible phone calls from his neighbors. The Meadowbrook case taught us that reality is often stranger than fiction, but it's rarely supernatural, Walsh observed during a recent interview. When citizens bring us complaints that seem impossible, our job isn't to immediately dismiss them or assume they're having mental health crises. Our job is to investigate thoroughly, follow the evidence wherever it leads, and remember that behind every strange story is a human being who deserves our protection and our respect. The case serves as a powerful reminder that in an age of rapidly advancing technology and increasingly sophisticated criminal methods, law enforcement officers must be prepared to encounter crimes that challenge traditional understanding of what is possible. The willingness to question assumptions, investigate thoroughly, and protect citizens regardless of how unusual their complaints might seem remains the foundation of effective police work. The Meadowbrook investigation stands as a testament to the importance of community vigilance, thorough police work, and the recognition that in a connected world, our greatest vulnerabilities often come from the very systems and relationships that are supposed to provide us with safety and security. The case continues to serve as both a cautionary tale and an inspiration, demonstrating that careful investigation and community cooperation can overcome even the most sophisticated criminal schemes. Today, as technology continues to evolve and create new opportunities for both connection and exploitation, the lessons of the Meadowbrook case remain as relevant as ever. The case serves as a permanent reminder that protecting our communities requires constant vigilance, adaptive thinking, and the unwavering commitment to take every citizen's safety seriously, no matter how impossible their complaints might initially appear to be.